Welcome to a series of videos on the book The Cantina Compendium. Each video will be based on a chapter of the book, and then some, which we will explain in a minute, but first, a little background. Beginning in 2010 or so, I began working on a book about the Mos Eisley Cantina. As a kid, it was my favorite scene of the original film, and it was probably my favorite Kenner playset. I began putting together every snippet, every anecdote, every offhand factoid, every known photograph and quote, etc., from books, magazines, television programs, documentaries, interviews, websites, you name it. It documents everything from Lucas's very first ideas of a spaceport cantina all the way to what I have termed the McClunky debacle. I also wanted to see if I could keep track of every single character that was in the cantina. And, as it turns out, there are 86-ish. We'll get to that later. You could look at these videos as more like a college course, and at the end of the semester you'll be certified in Cantinaology, which is a completely real field of study that I just made up. And there won't even be a final exam. Sometimes we'll get in the weeds, but it's going to be worth it. As the original introduction said, some mysteries will be solved, but others will be created. Such is the study of history. Nothing quite like the cantina scene had ever been attempted before on such a large scale in a movie. There were more rubber masks than in most Halloween aisles. But, for such a memorable part of the film, its creator seemed a little unsure of exactly what he had accomplished. Of course, its inspirations owed more to the saloons and barrooms of vintage westerns than to any specific science fiction that had come before. But one of Lucas's true masterstrokes was his successful merging of science fiction with space fantasy in a way that basically made a completely new genre. Before Star Wars, a bar in space probably would have been portrayed as shiny and sparse. Afterwards, any conglomerations of aliens in a room would try to recapture the magic of Mos Eisley. Lucas was never completely happy with the scene, and strangely enough, even though he was somewhat nervous about it, it seemed to stay in his blood, as he kept remaking it. Once, albeit somewhat debatedly uninvolved, for the holiday special, a more determined revision as Jabba's courtroom in Return of the Jedi, and again, less inspired for Attack of the Clones. I'm no prequel hater or anything, but that one just wasn't very good. Now let's look at what each chapter of the book is about. This is your syllabus for the course, so to speak. Chapter 1 will show how the idea of a spaceport barroom was one of the very first two that Lucas even had for his film, long before a plot of any kind began to emerge. It hung on through numerous drafts and complete revisions of his film without a story. This chapter will also show the initial design artwork that was done to invent the aliens that would populate such a place. In Chapter 2, we will look at the two teams of artists who brought those designs to life and what their exact contributions were. After filming completed, Lucas decided that the cantina needed to be even more crowded. At nearly the last minute, he received money for pickup shots to be filmed in the United States. Because of this and the editing style used in the film, it is virtually impossible to accurately map out the interior of the building. Chapter 3 will examine this and include some attempts to do so over the years. In Chapter 4, we will walk through the actual filming of the scene itself and examine in detail the Greedo scene and Obi-Wan's fight. We will also take a specific look at exactly what was added in those pickup shots that we mentioned, as well as the different filming setups that were involved, including the Cantina band themselves. Additionally, we will have a look at the audio, the soundtrack, and McClunky. It's important to point out that, from the perspective of a student of Joseph Campbell, as Lucas was, the Cantina represented the first underworld that Luke Skywalker, the hero, must descend into. This is the place he must choose to leave his innocence behind, begin to grow as a person, and emerge on the other side so that he can be advanced in his quest. Of course, this particular underworld is populated by scores of malevolent creatures, so in chapters 5 and 6, we will take an in-depth look at
every single one of them.
This section is roughly 120 pages of the original book, and there is tons of interesting information to be found. It may take a while. Besides Lucas's general apprehension about the cantina scene itself, Did you know that there was a period of time when it wasn't referenced in any marketing done for the film, and perhaps even purposefully excluded? And we are talking about a film that forever changed the way movies are marketed. What was going on here? Chapter 7 will attempt to unravel the details. In Chapter 8, we will look at the most significant attempts to portray the cantina in the form of toys and playsets in the last 40 plus years. And could we even consider the book to be complete without a chapter on the dreaded Star Wars holiday special? Yes, friends, in Chapter 9, we are going to stick our heads right into that lion's mouth, specifically to look at the lengthy, and hey, musical, cantina scene. What masks were used from the movie? What new aliens were added? Why can't we just talk about the Boba Fett cartoon instead? But don't worry, because in Chapter 10 we will get far away from B. Arthur and turn our focus to appearances of the cantina in other media. We begin with comics, where we take a look at the Marvel Comics run, followed by Mad and its copycat Star Wars parodies, at which point we then return to comics, even one in 3D. In our television section we feature Richard Pryor, wait, what? A drunk driving PSA, and some other stuff, followed by a look at audio, radio, very early home video, as in Super 8, and finally, some books before we collapse in exhaustion and give up. Well, that's the plan. Tune in next time when we begin the story and tackle Chapter 1. Be there or be square. Many people don't know that the cantina scene was one of the very earliest ideas that George Lucas had for what he was calling at the time his film without a story. In fact, there were two primary concepts that drove him. One was a cantina scene, the other was a space battle scene. And these drove him to write and rewrite various drafts over a 3-year period. The exact inspiration for the scene is unknown, but the late Chuck McCann, who was a comedian, character actor, voice artist, and much more, did have a theory. He told the story that while he and Bob Denver were filming the Croft television show The Far Out Space Nuts, George Lucas wandered into the studio cafeteria one day to see all of the Space Nuts cast sitting around having lunch while wearing various alien costumes, and he believed that this was the origin of the scene. Although this is a good story, it's probably not what initially inspired the idea of the cantina. The Far Out Space Nuts ran from 1975 to 1976, and while they were probably filming in 1974, the scene was already present in Lucas's very first written treatment from a full year before. Let's look at each of these versions in chronological order. First came a 14-page synopsis written in May of 1973, where Lucas describes the plot of his film as concerning a General Luke Skywalker whose goal is to escort a fugitive princess to safety, and they pass through a spaceport, doing so stopping in at a cantina. In this embryonic version of the story, the cantina's sole purpose seems to be providing us with an action scene, as the general pulls out his laser sword and kills a bully. In fact, in the comprehensive ebook The Secret History of Star Wars, author Michael Kaminsky points out that the scene is pretty much lifted from Akira Kurosawa's excellent Yojimbo, as Lucas was a dedicated student of Kurosawa. In May of 1974 came The Star Wars, a rough draft screenplay, and it contained a similar scene. This time General Skywalker is joined by Anakin Starkiller and a rebel spy named Klieg Whitson in his mission to escort the princess, who is now named Leia, and her two younger brothers to safety. They stop off at the spaceport's cantina, where General Skywalker uses his unique weapon to kill some attackers. Again, despite a much more convoluted plot, the cantina still showcases some lightsaber swordplay. From scene 79, the general's laser sword sparks to life. An arm lies on the floor. The rodent is cut in two, and the large, multiple-eyed creature lies doubled, cut from chin to groin. The general, with quiet dignity, replaces his sword in its sheath. The entire fight has lasted only a matter of seconds. That may pretty much remind you of something that's coming in the future, but we have a few more drafts to go before we get there. In the rough draft, the men are there to meet a contact, a pilot named Han Solo, although in this early incarnation he is, quote, a huge green-skinned monster with no nose and large gills. Otherwise, the dialogue that leads up to this bar fight is very similar to the filmed version, with the exception of the description of the aliens that fight with Luke. Let's fast forward to January 1975, where a complete rewrite was done of The Star Wars. The second draft was entitled The Adventures of the Starkiller Episode 1, The Star Wars, and was very different than what had come before, and much more rambling. This time, the Cantina is on the planet Utapau, which of course was a name that would not be discarded, and Luke Starkiller goes there after the arrival of his brother Deke's 2 droids, who bring him a message. The mysterious Kyber crystal, which is an object that can magnify the power of the Force, must not be allowed to fall into evil hands. Luke lives on a farm with his Uncle Owen, Aunt Beru, and 2 other brothers named Biggs and Wendy. Also living there is Owen and Beru's daughter, Leia. Luke leaves with the droids and the Kyber crystal and ends up in the cantina, where he has a run-in with not 2, but 3 drunken patrons. This, in turn, gets the attention of Han Solo, who offers him a ride to Organa Major, and it goes on from there. In the second draft, the bartender does stop the droids from entering the cantina, just like in the movie, but there are several curious differences from the final version. First, Lucas has a blind prophet at the door of the cantina, sort of a one-man Greek chorus, who tells Luke, "The man you seek you'll find inside. The one who needs you'll find in time." And Han Solo, who is now, quote, a burly-bearded but ruggedly handsome boy, dressed in a gaudy array of flamboyant apparel, whatever that means, now stands in the role of Obi-Wan Kenobi, since Kenobi wasn't yet invented, and he says lines like, "This little one isn't worth the effort." Also, after the fight, we're told that the bartender actually drags the bodies outside. As the final story for the film slowly began to gel, and before the third draft could be prepared, Lucas wrote a 6-page synopsis in May of 1975. This time, Luke Starkiller, who ends up with the captured Princess Leia's droids, stumbles upon a message inside the R2 unit saying the princess has been captured, as well as a signal device to locate her. In traveling to the spaceport, he gives a derelict hermit a ride, who is a prototype Obi-Wan. They go to the local cantina where Lucas writes, quote, "Bugs molest Luke, start fight." But this time it is the old man who cuts them down. They meet Han and Chewbacca, and the elderly warrior stays with them to participate in their rescue mission, but for his own reasons. He wants to find the Kyber crystal to defeat the Sith Knights. In August of 1975, a full third draft was completed, which was now called The Star Wars From the Adventures of Luke Starkiller. This story is much closer to the finished version, and the cantina description stays the same, as well as the altercation at the bar with Ben in his expected role at last. One major difference is the absence of Han. After Ben has a conversation with Chewbacca that the viewer does not hear, he and Luke follow the Wookiee to the docking bay, where the young pirate, referred to as a cowboy, is waiting with his ship. This would have been a remarkably different film if this had all played out, to not be introduced to Han Solo in the cantina, which is, after all, his element, and it helps us understand a lot about his character. Not to mention the absence of the Greedo scene. Meanwhile, Lucas had hired Alan Dean Foster, the eventual author of scores of science fiction novels, to ghostwrite the novelization for the upcoming movie, as well as to pen the sequel, which we would know as Splinter of the Mind's Eye. Foster has the distinction of writing not only the first Star Wars book, but the first spin-off as well, where, ironically, the idea of a force-increasing crystal was eventually used. The novel, Star Wars From the Adventures of Luke Skywalker, was published in late 1976 and beat the film by a good 6 months, which was probably planned, as was the Marvel comic. With the script to work from, Foster fleshed out the details, while Lucas was busy reworking his story even as he began filming. As you would expect, there are some differences. Obi-Wan goes into the bar specifically looking for Corellians because they are so often known to be pirates. The bartender explains to Luke that he doesn't serve droids and adds, "I only carry stuff for organics, not mechanicals." Obi-Wan speaks to Chewbacca, but in his own language, quote, quarreling and hooting softly like a native. Luke has 3 antagonists. The native who shoves Luke is, quote, a large squarish monstrosity of multiple eyes and indeterminate origin. The second is, quote, a cross between a capybara and a small baboon. And the third is the grubby human that we now know as Dr. Evazan, or Evazan, whichever. It is this human that actually loses an arm to Kenobi. The rodent-like alien is cut cleanly in half down the middle, while the third many-eyed alien is also bisected, but fires its blaster before its body separates, quote, blowing a hole in the door. Only then does the body of the alien fall apart, like something from an Ultraman episode. Meanwhile, quote, the mutilated human vanished wordlessly into the crowd, cradling the stump of his gun arm and calling himself fortunate. Foster describes the other residents of the cantina as, quote, creatures with scales, creatures with fur, and some with skin that seem to ripple and change consistency according to their feelings. He also has Luke think to himself that the darkness of the bar contrasts with the brightness of the entrance so that everybody inside, quote, could see each newcomer before he could see them, which really sets the mood of the scene. The subsequent fourth draft of the script brought forth the final version, and various battles were fought with Fox as the film was at last underway. As early as 1974, Lucas had hired Ralph McQuarrie, a brilliant artist and former technical illustrator for Boeing, to complete some artwork to help him visualize his story. On the short list of names without whom we would have no Star Wars, Ralph McQuarrie's name should be listed just under that of George Lucas. Besides designing Darth Vader, Chewbacca, the Stormtroopers, the droids, and several sets for the film, contributing heavily to the overall look of Lucas's story, his fingerprints are all over the rest of the first trilogy. His work combined the lines and discipline of a master draftsman with the unbridled creativity of a true visionary. The paintings amazed the Fox decision-makers so much it helped convince them to greenlight the project, although McQuarrie himself thought that the resulting film would be far too expensive to ever see the light of day. Among that first group of paintings that he did was a cantina scene. This is McQuarrie's initial concept painting of the cantina at Mos Eisley. This was the fifth painting that was finished, and according to the book The Making of Star Wars, portrays Han Solo trying to outdraw an alien as described in the second draft. It should also be pointed out that this doesn't line up exactly with the second draft description of Han Solo that we've just talked about. Perhaps it is Luke Starkiller reaching for a prototype lightsaber instead. According to McQuarrie's own recollections of the way that he and Lucas would work together, he would begin by listening to descriptions of what the director wanted, and then make some preliminary sketches. Lucas would offer suggestions as they went, and McQuarrie would often correct his own drawings, repeating the entire process until a rough draft could be put together. He would then add his own personal touches, which resulted in a finished painting. One of McQuarrie's methods was to draw on layers of tissue paper, which allowed him to add and subtract from the scene as he went. As the deadline to begin filming loomed ever closer, Lucas hired costume designer John Mallow. Mallow was an authority on military uniforms, and he had served as advisor on the 1966 film The Charge of the Light Brigade. This would be his first film as a full-fledged costume designer, and he would also contribute quite a bit to The Empire Strikes Back. With the cantina scene written, now all that was missing were bizarre aliens to populate it. Between John Mallow, Ralph McQuarrie, artist Ron Cobb, and the newly hired Stuart Freeborn, numerous designs were submitted for approval. We will look at some leftovers that did not make the final cut in a moment, but first, let's look at John Mallow's chart of finalized concepts. You have probably seen this image before. It gets a lot of mileage and has been in a lot of books and different websites. Drawn by Mallow, it is dated April 3rd, 1976, and it shows 23 different designs for Cantina aliens. What a lot of people don't realize, though, is that there are actually two different versions of this chart. The second version has lots of added written-in notations. The clean version probably just looks better in print, but for our purposes here we're going to need the other one, which you can find in the hefty and expensive The Star Wars Chronicles, and it yields a wealth of information. This second version begins to fill in some actors' names. It isn't quite complete, and it includes some things that did not even see the light of day, such as Stuart Freeborn's grasshopper alien, which we'll look at in a moment. Some names are a bit confusing as to which alien they are referring to. Some are scratched out, and occasionally the math doesn't add up as to how many of each character there would be. However, this is still a valuable and rare glimpse into the design work behind the cantina scene. We will of course deal with the finalized versions of each character in their own sections in chapters 5 and 6, but here we are staying within the confines of Mallow's chart. Number 1, the Fly. This is pretty close to how this nearly unseen character would turn out. The notes say wide shoulders and white belt plus holster. Number 2, Rodent. One interesting revelation here is this character was originally supposed to have some sort of external breathing mask, which you will note has been crossed out in the drawing. Please note that this is not a Jawa, although some people think there might be or might have been a connection. Number 3, Bartender. Note the giant necklace. Try to imagine what it would have looked like in the final film. Number 4, Grubby Human, as in Dr. Evazan, although in this drawing he looks much more like one of Jabba's henchmen who would end up with goggles and a vest with pockets. Numbers 5 and 6, Farmers. 4 of them are indicated on the chart in 2 different designs, and they look very similar to Luke and Obi-Wan. Number 7, Corellian Pirates. 3 of these are indicated, but as the drawing looks kind of like Han Solo, it would make sense that he was probably counted as one of them. Note that the name Ron Tar is listed. He is the largest of Jabba's henchmen, the burly one with the beard, and is occasionally given the name Davalin Shmi. Number 8, Star Pilots. Again, 3 of these are indicated, but it's a little difficult to identify them all, as we will see. Number 9, Bureaucrats. This one is interesting because it appears that they were originally meant to be wearing Imperial uniforms. It does make perfect sense for off-duty or well-to-do Imperials to be lounging in a cantina, but perhaps it would have been too confusing for the audience or our heroes, and the idea was dropped. Also, 3 of these are indicated, but only 2 ended up in the final scene, as far as we can tell. Number 10, Local Girls. This is crossed out on the chart, but this may have had more to do with the costumes, as both actresses listed were indeed in the cantina. Jenny Cresswell played Jenny, and Mandy Morton's character later came to be named Swilla Corey. Number 11, Space Girls. These were later known as the Tonica Sisters. The notes indicate that the costume should have a, quote, tight top, and also, check out that mohawk. Number 12, Weird Girl. This is also crossed out, but looks pretty much exactly like she ended up in the film. At this stage, the design on top of her head looks kind of like a brain, but in the end, this was accomplished with braids of hair. Number 13, Spacemen. Probably intended as filler for the cantina and depended on what existing spacesuits were available from the studio, which we will examine in detail when we come to them. Number 14, Local Ugly Men. Again, this was filler for the crowd. Basically, the difference between this group and the group of farmers was putty noses. Also, it should be pointed out that the Ugly Agency was an actual place that actors came from, and this may have something to do with that. Number 15, Grasshopper. This is a completely unused concept that was designed by Stuart Freeborn. It's not really known why this was unused. It was not merely replaced with the praying mantis because that's number 18. It may have simply been too difficult to accomplish. The actor that was listed for the character was Barry Copping, who apparently played the Landspeeder dealer alien. Number 16, Martians. It's interesting to see that Greedo almost had 4 arms. Not only were the nicknames swapped between the Plutonians and the Martians, but 2 arms were donated as well. Number 17, Plutonians. The actors were also swapped because Paul Blake played Greedo in London in the original Cantina filming. Some people think that there ended up being 2 of these aliens in the cantina, but there is no proof that it's not the same costume. Number 18, Praying Mantis. The drawing, which is marked out, indicates that actor Jack Purvis was to be inside of this costume, which he was, and that it was more of a puppet. Number 19, Snaggletooth. This also looks pretty close to how the finished costume turned out, complete with Hunchback. Number 20, Crockers. A little lankier, but otherwise close to the finished products, of which there were 2. 21, Walrus. This drawing is also similar to the final costumes, but in the end, the 2 walrus aliens would be distinguished from each other by completely different hair arrangements. Please note this has nothing to do with Walrus Man, who is nowhere to be seen on this chart. Number 22, Colonel. This chart lists ×1, but there were 2 of these aliens that were actually made. However, the Colonel is the fatter one of the 2. Number 23, Bat. A general idea of the final costume, but much taller. Looking at the notes section of this chart, a few interesting things can be seen, including the mention of a, quote, orchestra, as if some sort of band was planned all along. What jumps out at us is this line. This consists of 4 men, 1 times number 3, 1 times number 7, plus 2 others. It's clear that 4 band members were planned, but what do these numbers refer to? All we have to go by are the costume numbers on the chart, which leaves us with 1 number 3, which is the bartender, and 1 number 7, which is a Corellian pirate. That makes no sense at all. The best that we can do is walk away with the knowledge that at this very early stage, some sort of group of musicians was already planned, and this was before the reshoots that were done in the United States. As to the rest of the additions of Malo's chart, Jawas and Stormtroopers, which we know as Sand Troopers, do make sense, but apparently 2 of the, quote, little people actors were last-minute additions. In the lower right corner of the chart, the following 2 names appear, each with a box drawn around them. The, quote, Flash Gordon Midget got a prominent place at the front of the bar, but Gilda Cohen's face is nowhere to be seen in the cantina. Take a look at this photo. That's Gilda Cohen in the lower right. Does her costume look familiar to you? In the actual film, Gilda Cohen was the stand-in for Cabe, who was played by Rusty Goff, and it's unknown what was originally planned for her as Little Aunt Beru. You'll note that this designation of Little Aunt Beru from Malo's chart unfortunately became applied to a different actor who is a completely different gender by fans for years. This is the best place to look at some unused concepts that were rejected and never made into actual masks or costumes. This first group was drawn by Ralph McQuarrie. And here is the grasshopper alien we mentioned from John Mallow's chart, also worked on by Stuart Freeborn, which was ultimately unused. It may have been decided in the end that there were simply too many bugs in the cantina. Here's an excellent design by artist Ron Cobb. The writing that you may not be able to see in this photo says tropical rainforest ambulatory plant, traps and absorbs insect-like creatures, great sense of humor, best joke tellers in the galaxy. This creature was listed as simply Arctic in the notes. Very interestingly, it appears that somebody found it in the archives later because it ended up in a C-3PO cereal commercial from 1984. Here are a couple of unused concepts from artist Lane Liska. In the bottom left-hand corner, though, is an alien that we're going to see again shortly. This piece was part of artist Phil Tippett's collection that was auctioned in October 2016. While we're talking about Phil Tippett, here are a couple of sketchbook pages that were also part of that auction. Some of these were indicated as cantina designs, but some may merely be doodles. This is an elaborate examination of how a grasshopper-type puppet would have worked, so there was a lot of time spent on this grasshopper idea. Next time, we're going to take a closer look at the two distinct groups of artists who were responsible for bringing these designs to life. And keep in mind, their designs were used for two separate cantina filmings, which were done on two different continents and in two different calendar years. We'll see you then. Okay, this short chapter looks at the two completely different groups of artists who brought the cantina to life. We're going to begin with Stuart Freeborn. It's difficult to condense the massive career of Stuart Freeborn, who was a legend in the makeup and costuming world. Freeborn was born in 1914 in what is now London, England, and his output is a laundry list of blockbusters. The ape costumes from the first sequence of 2001: A Space Odyssey, Dr. Strangelove, The Omen, all four original Superman films, and of course, the entire original Star Wars trilogy. Besides bringing Chewbacca and his most famous creation, Yoda, to life, he and his team, which included his wife Kay, who supervised much of the human makeup for the rest of the film, his son Graham, and 6 assistants, together created the original group of Cantina aliens and made-up humans. If this was the only thing they had to do, it would still have been an impressive amount of work, especially if you read the details involved in making the original Chewbacca costume. You can find this photo in Star Wars Insider number 130. It is used as a one-page feature entitled Rogues Gallery: The Usual Suspects, and gives names and homeworlds for each alien. In this photo, Graham Freeborn glues pieces onto a Martian mask, while Kay Freeborn works on the Bat, who we know as Cabe. Note in the background the unfinished fly mask sitting underneath 2 snaggletooths. As we've said, sometime after the cantina scene was completed and edited, Lucas felt that the scene could be improved. Interviews were conducted with numerous makeup and effects people until Dennis Muren gave the name of Rick Baker to George Lucas. Baker, born 1950 in Binghamton, New York, had been obsessed with makeup effects since childhood, and while he was still in high school, got a job at Art Clokey Productions, as in Gumby, where he met Doug Beswick, an animator that he would later recruit for Star Wars. Having completed several projects, such as John Landis's Schlock in 1971, which will actually come up again later, The Exorcist, Live and Let Die, the horror movie It's Alive in 1974, which will also come up again later, and the 1976 King Kong, where he ended up actually wearing the suit and playing Kong, Baker was an in-demand talent in the industry. By the time that Lucas responded and offered him the job, Baker had already taken on another film, The Incredible Melting Man. and he could not commit the time that it would involve to produce the extra Cantina aliens by himself. He and Lucas both agreed that if they could put a team together, Baker could serve as a supervisor and oversee the work. For this team, he assembled a group composed entirely of stop-motion animators: Doug Beswick, Lane Liska, Phil Tippett, and John Berg, along with his assistant, Rob Botten. By teaching them the basics of mask making and filling in hours when he could, the men were able to complete around 13 different aliens in just a 6-week time period. Sharp-eyed viewers will also note the Greedo mask at the far left of this photo. Another of Baker's tasks was the addition of a mechanism which would enable the mouth to move. Sort of. These initial 13 aliens were supplemented by some existing masks that Baker had already made. As we will see again later in Chapter 7, this solution saved time, but caused some accidental licensing problems down the line. If you don't know who Rungs is, let's go back to the group photo we looked at before. Directly over Phil Tippett's shoulder, you will see the puppet, later to be known as a 1010 dwarf. Although unused in the movie, it would eventually become a Cantina customer, except it would be in
the Star Wars Holiday Special.
Here's a couple of rare photos that show the inside of the studio space that Rick Baker and his team used. These photos were included in 454 lots that Phil Tippett allowed to be auctioned off in October of 2016. In this photo, you'll note an unpainted Duros mask, as well as a note on the blackboard, which was apparently how Baker and his team communicated. The note says, "Rick, Rob," who was Baker's assistant, "took his Martian. We'll bring it back." Rick Baker retired in 2015 after a long career where he won numerous awards, including several Oscars. His filmography reads like a greatest hits list of special effects and makeup, and I suggest that you check it out. Now that we've seen the evolution of the Cantina and the design work involved, and we've learned about the craftsmen who were responsible for populating it, we're going to spend some time looking at the layout of the physical building itself. Hopefully, we can figure out a few things about its floor plan, but trust me, it won't be easy. Thanks for watching. On your 40th or so viewing of Star Wars, A New Hope, did you start to notice that it's very hard to get an exact sense of the exact layout of the Cantina? After all, the only landmark that the viewer really has is the bar itself, and we are left trying to relate all the action to this central fixture. Where exactly is the bandstand or the stage? How many alcoves are off of the main bar room? And how were there possibly enough of these side rooms to accommodate all of the tables of creatures that we are shown? Well, just like in the famous Tootsie Pops commercial,
the world may never know.
Actually, I was just being dramatic, but let's work with what we do know. First, let's start with the very earliest sketch, which production designer John Barry made in 1975 at George Lucas's suggestions. Lucas knew that he wanted a, quote, round bar, and we've already discussed the idea for a skylight. The only other request that he had was for alcoves coming off of the main room. In the drawing, you can see the offset entrance, with steps descending into the main area. You can also see that the original bar was a complete rounded rectangle in the center of the room, which was to change later. So let's count 9 alcoves, right? Well, not exactly. Next, we move to a photo of a scale model, a mock-up of the set that was done in preparation for construction. This picture is invaluable because it is probably the best source that we will ever have to see exactly what the floor plan of the finished set was like in 3 dimensions. Notice that I said the finished set because the extra scenes that would be added in would muddy the waters quite a bit. At the bottom left corner of the model space it says 6 floater coves for cover on opposite side. You can see that the design of the bar has now been changed to a U shape, which now ends at the back wall of the bar room. The back rooms to the immediate left and right of the bar really are not alcoves at all. This is very difficult to see in the film, but we can work with what we have to examine them closer. Here's a photo you'll be seeing again under the section on the praying mantis alien. This photo shows us that at least on the right side of the bar, the small room does not contain a table and chairs, merely storage boxes. This of course does make sense as to why only a back wall would have to be built, because it's all that the camera would see. And with the size of the crowd that Lucas wanted spilling over into the side rooms, the doorways would be blocked by characters that were milling about anyhow. Now let's look at the left side of the bar. This is nearly impossible to see in the movie, but here is what is probably the clearest photo that exists. This is a valuable photo for several reasons, but for our purposes here, it gives us the best view of the left-hand back room that we are going to get. We can't really see if anyone is entering or leaving the room in the cantina scene as we have it in the film, so what exactly is back there? Unfortunately, the January filming in California complicated this issue just a little bit, in rather an anachronistic way, which the magic of movies often allows for. As we mentioned, because of issues with the Greedo mask, the character's close-ups for his interaction with Han Solo needed to be refilmed. In fact, as we talked about in Chapter 2, it was Rick Baker's team that was tasked with upgrading the mask, adding air-powered movable antennae as well as a moving mouth feature. This mechanism later failed, which required an attempt at rigging the mask with a clothespin that was held in the actor's mouth. Here, though, we will only look at the staging of the extra Greedo scenes. It was decided to have some background characters over Greedo's shoulder because, after all, the goal of these extra scenes was to make the cantina appear even busier than it already was. During the conversation, what movie audiences saw was Harrison Ford filmed in London and Greedo filmed a second time in America, which, as you can see, presents a bit of a problem for those of us who are trying to determine the actual layout of the bar room. Han Solo's alcove, where he talks to Luke and Ben, and later, Greedo, is the middle of the 3 alcoves along the left-hand side of the room. This is pretty easy to figure out. You can see this in the film when he makes his exit after frying poor Greedo. The lost cut original rough edit of the cantina scene, which was first released on a CD-ROM in 1998 and later in the Blu-ray set of 2011, shows 2 aliens over Greedo's shoulder, who would be located about here. Yet, somehow, because of the reshoots, there is now a back room visible over Greedo's shoulder, containing a table, 2 different customers, and a window to the outside. So, even if we are meant to think that there is seating back there, it's still not an identical alcove to the other 6. But then again, even 8 alcoves makes it difficult to place everyone since so many groups of aliens are shown sitting together in the film. Even if you concede that not every table in the cantina is in a private room of its own, we still have to leave 1 alcove for the band. One very early Star Wars publication that was produced was a set of Star Wars blueprints that were printed by Ballantine in 1977. This was a packet that included copies of real film-used blueprints of different vehicles and sets. This blueprint, drafted by Alan Roderick Jones, gives some specifics to the central feature of the room, the bar and the drink dispenser itself. Even by magnifying the picture substantially, it is still difficult to read the written words, which are mostly technical terminology and specifics for set design. However, a few interesting factoids can still be gleaned. For example, the top right of the plans shows a design for the bar that was not used, which includes a gutter along the edge with a grill, quote, to catch spill from glasses. There is a large NG written over the top of this section, which I assume to be no-go. Between the detail of the drink dispensing station and the silhouettes of customers for scale, there appears to be an example of what the trim that surrounds the skylight above the bar would be like. Pointing to the top are the words 1 foot 6 inches VF from Sandcrawler, which obviously refers to the materials. Also written above this section is the following: open section above bar to be cooled with gauze, referring to the way the light source would be diffused to give the desired effect inside the bar. The majority of the rest of this page refers to the drink dispensing station, explaining which vessels are glass, which are metal, and pointing out the height of the pipes must vary. One note reads, steam to come from sides, leading the reader to believe that perhaps the goal was a little bit more of a mad scientist setup. The aerial view of this section, above the blueprint's title, has a large central cylinder with notation that reads, "Liquid nitrogen container." There are also 4 built-in computer keyboards that would be accessible to the bartender. Near the bottom right-hand corner of the blueprint, there is a list of different colors and metallic finishes for the drink containers, and the words, "Props, all containers to be practical." The title on this sheet is Detail Number 2, and it would be many years before fans would have a chance to see other pages that were involved with the construction of this set. That chance finally came with the publication of an expensive coffee table book called Star Wars: The Blueprints in 2013. Besides an easier-to-read image of this number 2 blueprint, which is dated January 24th, 1976, 4 other Cantina-related blueprints are included. 2 of these show designs for decorative panels which were apparently unused. One shows the surface of a, quote, Cantina pool table, which is thought to be the gaming table in the background of the deleted Anchorhead scene. The last new blueprint is a fleshed-out evolution of the mock-up model we saw earlier, labeled Interior Cantina Plan and Elevations. It shows 6 distinct arched alcoves, with the 2 back rooms being smaller and having no windows. It also indicates that the walls would be plastered but cracked to give the rundown look that Lucas was hoping to achieve. Set designer John Barry said, "George wanted those cubicles. There was the main part where the action was, but there was also a secret part where you could have a secret discussion. You had to have this maze quality where you could feel lost, so you wouldn't know what was around the corner." Only a couple of photos have surfaced to show the construction of the actual set that was built for filming in April of 1976. Paul Blake, who played Greedo, said, "It was the nicest set because it was a real one and not in Tunisia." Before we go further, let's work our way around the completed structure of the cantina itself. Here's the entryway foyer, complete with droid detector. One thing I never knew as a kid is that there's actually seating in the entryway, and what looks like a spittoon. Hasbro at least assumed it belonged there because it made it to the backdrop of one of their 3-packs in the 90s. Here's the center view from the front of the bar. Here's the left side of the bar room. And here is the right side. There are several decorative items in the cantina that we cannot get a close look at in the film, such as the large shield-shaped object hanging on the wall on the left side of the room. A few years back, the official website pointed out some other strange fixtures. One is shaped like a crocodile. The other is a very strange gargoyle that, like the rest of the ceiling, is never seen in the final film. It looks much like the sort of thing you would later see in Jabba the Hutt's palace or on his sail barge. So, as we will see in the chapter about Cantina playsets over the years, you have to make concessions if you're going to map out the cantina or find the correct place to put your action figures, because in reality not everyone was actually there at the same time. This is why no 2 cantina representations ever seem to be exactly alike. To that point, here are a few noteworthy examples over the years at establishing a cantina floor plan. This schematic was first published in Starlog Magazine's Technical Journal in 1993, and again in the Star Wars Technical Journal in 1995. It isn't completely accurate, of course, but a good try nonetheless. This design was improved upon by Jason Weatherly on his excellent website to try to make it more movie accurate, as well as document each alien's position in the cantina. DK Books, known for their high-quality Star Wars releases, had to get very creative when they mapped out the Mos Eisley Cantina for their book of cutaway diagrams. A foreign site called Yodapedia.net also attempted to map the cantina with this poster, which featured an elaborate map and chart. The Star Wars Miniatures role-playing game included the cantina on this Tatooine map with a very different layout. Okay, next time in Chapter 4 we're going to turn our attention to the actual filmings of the scene itself, done both in London and in America. We'll catch you later. Alright, we have a lot of ground to cover today, so hang on tight. First, filming commenced in Tunisia, where Lucas and company selected the town of Ajim on the island of Jerba, which is just off the western coast of Africa. The foreign architecture there appealed to them, and they were able to supplement it with facades to give the appearance of a spaceport. The exterior shots of the building that would serve as the cantina were filmed April 2nd and 3rd, 1976. This, of course, was just the exterior. The real cantina was constructed at Stage 6 at Elstree Studios in England. Records say that at least 42 extras, but probably more, were hired to populate the intricate set and turn it into a hive of scum and villainy. The filming of Scene 50 began April 13th and continued on until the 20th. Despite the stress and difficulty associated with making the first Star Wars movie, there are no accounts of any major problems filming the scene. Art director Norman Reynolds said, "I think we felt perhaps not quite as much pressure as the makeup department, because they had a lot to do. Star Wars has melded in my memory into one general sort of constant panic, but the cantina doesn't leap out especially." Actually, the panic would come later, when the finished product was viewed. We have mentioned the original edit of the unfinished film, referred to as the Lost Cut, which was done by John Jempson. In this original version, the cantina scene has a completely different pacing, with a panning, documentary-type feel, lingering too long on the bizarre creatures like a gawking spectator. In fact, in its first release on the 1998 Behind the Magic CD-ROM, it is presented on the same screen above the version from the final film, which actually has to pause several times to allow the lost cut to catch up. After a less than successful screening of this cut held at George Lucas's house, the director determined to tighten up and recut his entire film, and together he, his wife Marcia, Paul Hirsch, and Richard Chew gave the film the vibrancy and energy that we are all now used to. The blueprints that we looked at in a previous chapter called for the bar itself to be made of perspex, which would, quote, run the length of the bar, and, quote, be lit from behind. The seams in the bar are far less evident in the film than in this on-set photo, which provides a clue that this lighting idea was perhaps tried and ultimately not used, or at least toned down quite a bit.
211, take 3, guide track. Action! Sorry.
Can I take another one?
Improving and rejiggering the film involved the shooting of extra scenes, done in January and February of 1977. A big part of the budget for these additions went to the construction and filming of the extra aliens that Rick Baker and his team had created, including the replacement Greedo shots. This additional cantina filming took place on January 24th and 25th at Dovington's, a small studio in Hollywood that not much is actually known about. Shooting more cantina footage meant that at least part of the cantina set had to be rebuilt, and this was accomplished in a very clever way, by building one alcove that could be reversed and redressed as needed for each different group of creatures, giving the appearance of multiple rooms. We can show this by taking a closer look at this photo. Luckily, we can be 100% sure that it's not flipped horizontally as Star Wars photos sometimes are because of the visible logo on this moving box. Pay special attention to this spot of plaster at the top of the half of an arched wall. Now, look at this photo. There's the same spot, now on the inside corner. Also, notice that the red and blue lines that decorate the outside of cantina walls and arches were painted on both sides of the half wall, so that it would always look correct, even though this really didn't show up in the final film. By making minor changes to the interior of the booth, this ingenious method allowed for the filming of 8 different alcove setups, which we are going to look at now. Please note, the order I have assigned to these alcoves is completely arbitrary. The only thing that we can be sure of is that Hammerhead's table was the first one filmed. This first alcove has 4 lights on the right side, in the order of red, blue, blue, red. There are 2 light fixtures to the right of the window, as well as a bench to the right with stools in the center and left. In the second alcove are the same 4 lights, unchanged from the previous setup, and no light fixtures on the wall. There is more seating in the room as this is the most crowded of all the alcoves. The third alcove still keeps the same 4 lights unchanged from the previous setup, with the 2 light fixtures identical to the first alcove, which is barely quickly visible in the final film. Alcove number 4 has a molding strip on the right wall, just as Han Solo's booth in the cantina had. There are now colored lights to the right of the window from top to bottom, blue, blue, and red, with a bench on the right and 2 other stools. The fifth alcove has the same 4 lights we have seen before, with no light fixtures that can be seen. Alcove number 6 is the one for the cantina band. It has no colored lights at all, no light fixtures, with stools for the 2 seated band members, which admittedly can be hard to see. There are 2 strange chrome containers occasionally visible behind the band, which we can get a much better look at in this photo we saw earlier. According to Doug Beswick, about 4 weeks into their 6-week assignment, Lucas and producer Gary Kurtz dropped by to check on their progress, and stopped to look at the alien that Beswick was working on. Quote, "It was just supposed to be another one of the heads in the group. Then they sort of huddled together and came back and said, 'Hey, could you make more of this guy?' And I said, 'Sure, we can make as many as you want.' And they said, 'We want to have a little combo in the barroom scene.' That was the first we had heard of it." Making up the band of 7, and yes, there are actually 7, were Lane Liska, Phil Tippett, John Berg, Doug Beswick, and 3 production secretaries from ILM. Rick Baker, already committed to The Incredible Melting Man, was unable to be at the actual filming by his own admission. Since the band was intended to be moving to their own music, Lucas played a recording of Benny Goodman's Sing, Sing, Sing on set for the actors to mime along with. The band was filmed 3 times for about 20 minutes each, and an amusing story came from those takes. Since the only opening in the cantina band masks ended up being plugged up with an instrument, several performers nearly passed out. "It was a lot of fun watching the dailies," said Rick Baker. "All of a sudden, one guy would stand up and point to his mouth for oxygen. There was also some funny stuff where the heads caved in. They were breathing so hard, the whole head was contracting and expanding." Eventually, producer Gary Kurtz saved the day by going around with a razor blade or knife and slicing gills into the curvatures of the masks, to everyone's great relief when the air came rushing in. The 7th alcove setup belongs to the pair of Duros aliens, and admittedly the spot chosen to film them may not be a unique alcove setup at all. In the film, there is a quick reaction shot to Greedo's death, where the Duros are shown again and appear to be seated, like in this photo. This could have been filmed in any booth configuration that we have seen and may not be a unique setup. This first attempt at filming Greedo's close-ups contains 2 lights to his left, blue and red. To his right is a unique lantern fixture. What we can't see in this photo is whether there is a table in the background over Greedo's shoulder at this point. Note the presence of R2-D2 in the left side of the photo. This tells us that other pickup shots were filmed during the 2 days at Dovington's, which does make sense, because he's certainly not in any of the scenes that concern us here. For the final setup that was used, the lantern was removed, leaving a large medallion to the right of Greedo's head, which matches the London filming. The website partsofstarwars.com notes that ILM Secretary Maria de Aragon wore a pair of Duros hands for this shoot. Several photos show that Greedo was having difficulty keeping the gun still. So Lucas devised a pile of objects, including a roll of tape, to rest it on. I've always wanted to say this. You may be aware that Tarkin was in fuzzy slippers, but did you know that Greedo was wearing high heels? In this photo, George just noticed. At the table, which is visible over Greedo's shoulder, is the Side or Mayo alien with his back to the camera, and one Duros who is wearing the same large jacket as the Wolfman with the light-up eyes. This Duros is played by a young girl who is probably another member of the staff at ILM. If you've ever wondered what alien does the walk-by over Greedo's shoulder during his close-ups, the answer is that a third Godel, or High Tundra, was made by throwing the mask together with whatever was lying around. We will cover him and his two goat brethren in Chapter 6. This group of photos is a little confusing. It appears that Lucas wanted to try a close-up of Greedo standing up, and therefore had to use this finished back wall. At least that's the best I can come up with. Artist and designer Susie Rice, who had been hired by George Lucas to design the bid brochure for the film, and in doing so created the famous Star Wars logo as well, stopped by the Dovington studio to receive Lucas's final approval on the brochure so that it could be printed. On her website, she recounts a very amusing story about this event. Quote, "This later meeting was held at a soundstage in Midtown Los Angeles where, from behind a nondescript storefront south of Hollywood Boulevard, accessible directly from the city sidewalk along a major street, Greedo answered the door. An actor in Greedo's makeup and costume opened the door, smoking a cigarette out of a straw affixed to the end of Greedo's nose, and smoke billowed out all around the edges of Greedo's face from neck to brow. By that time, I wasn't surprised at anything. Downtown Los Angeles, city sidewalk opening to filming, Greedo smoking a cigarette out of a straw stuck in his nose, Los Angeles. So I walked past Greedo and found George in the back directing the filming of inserts for the bar scene. Big moment seeing him directing film footage." An attempt at upgrading the gore in Walrus Man's death was filmed, but cooler heads, pun intended, prevailed. This included doing the same for his severed arm, which was actually changed into one with a hairy hand and fingers, supposedly because George Lucas felt the original one would not be able to properly hold a gun, and in doing so created what may be the very first Star Wars anachronism. And look what a surprised audience at Star Wars Celebration 6 in 2012 got to see. George Lucas is famously quoted as saying, "Sound is 50% of the picture, and it's definitely crucial to adding a sense of believability to impossible situations." Enter Ben Burtt, born 1948, Jamesville, New York. Lucas, looking to hire someone from his own alma mater of USC, had Burtt recommended to him by a professor from the School of Cinema. Burtt had grown up as someone fascinated with sound and its manipulation, and had collected a personal library of his own sounds. At the time Burtt accepted the job, he had only seen the handful of Ralph McQuarrie's early production paintings. The rest, of course, is history, but for our purposes here, the book The Sounds of Star Wars spends a few pages talking with Burtt about how some specific Cantina sounds and voices were made. Besides using outtakes and unused bits that were left over from the creation of the voices for R2-D2 and the Jawas, Burtt used several techniques to create the background crowd sounds, what is known in the industry as walla, for the Cantina. Several crew and staff members volunteered to help. Burtt rented a tank of helium, and the group spent several hilarious hours inhaling it and attempting to talk to each other. The results were recorded and manipulated by Burtt to create the background chatter in the Cantina. Specific alien voices were created by using other methods. One alien voice was a friend of Burt's reading Latin aloud, which Burtt processed through a synthesizer. The sounds of a hippopotamus, a spring peeper tree frog, and laughing hyenas were also used. The voices for the two Juros aliens were created by chopping up a recording of someone speaking Swahili. The sounds for the lovable Muftak are actually Ben Burtt's own voice processed through an ARP synthesizer. Ironically, the sounds Walrus Man makes originated from an actual walrus. When developing a voice for Greedo, Burt was interested in the ancient Incan language of Quechua, but couldn't find anyone who could speak it. He was led to a Berkeley student named Larry Ward, who could speak 11 languages. Ward did not actually speak Quechua, but could very convincingly imitate it, and together he and Burt timed phrases to fit the mouth movements of Greedo's mask, and between the two of them effectively invented the beginnings of the Huttese language. Once recorded, the voice track was doubled and phased to produce the desired effect. No book or documentary about any facet of Star Wars should leave out the music of John Williams. The amazing soundtracks that Williams wrote are as much a vital component of the films as any other. When it came to George Lucas's bar scene, he knew that he wanted something different. In an interview, John Williams told the story of seeing the finished scene without music, and he was baffled at what sounds these aliens would actually be playing. Asking Lucas about it, the director said, quote, "Well, I have an idea. What if these little creatures on this planet way out someplace came upon a rock, and they lifted up the rock, and underneath was sheet music from Benny Goodman's great swing band of the 1930s on planet Earth, and they looked at this music and they kind of deciphered it, but they didn't quite know how it should go, but they tried. And, why don't you try doing that? What would these space creatures, what would their imitation of Benny Goodman sound like?" So Williams delivered, and the result was two pieces, Cantina Band, later renamed Mad About Me in Universe, and Cantina Band 2, that would be impossible to imagine the scene without. In fact, besides the Star Wars opening theme, it is probably the most recognizable music in all the films. Williams described the instrumentation and its effect on the charm of the recording. Quote, "We didn't have electronic instruments exactly in that period very much. They're all little Trinidad steel drums and out-of-tune kazoos and little reed instruments, you know. It was all done acoustically. It wasn't an electronic preparation as it probably would have been done today. I think that may be also part of its success, because being acoustic it meant people had to blow the notes and make all the sounds, a little out of tune and a little behind there, a little ahead there. It had all the foibles of a not very good human performance." Star Wars fans are more than familiar with the changes that George Lucas has made to the Cantina scene over the years, especially with regard to who shot first. When the Plus streaming service launched in the fall of 2019, fans received another shock. The scene had been altered again. Now, right before the dual blaster fire, we are treated to reuse frames of an angry Greedo yelling, "McClunky!" Fans were instantly perplexed. Dozens of articles reported on the change, and after a few days it was announced that this alteration was made by George Lucas himself, quote, "sometime before the sale to in 2012. Although it can't be too long before, though, because it certainly wasn't included in the 2011 Blu-ray set. What nobody reported on, though, was that the voice was Larry Ward's, and it certainly sounds like him to my ears, meaning that this was an actual unused vintage piece of dialogue. In fact, one article pointed out that the phrase, which means "I will end you," was actually used in The Phantom Menace, spoken to Anakin by Sebulba. Pronounced a little differently, but it's there. Maybe that was part of Lucas's reasoning for making yet another unnecessary change?
The world may never know.
Next time, it's here, it's finally here. Next time, we will begin our A to Z look at every single Cantina guest, starting with Elstree Studios in Chapter 5. We will see them all from Athlo to Zutton. You might want to bring a snack.
I don't think they'd like another killing in here.
They'd hardly notice.
This is an A to Z look at every single alien and human customer in the Mos Eisley Cantina, before the special edition, of course. This group of 56 or so entries makes up the entire contents of the original Elstree Cantina shoot in London. Basically, this section is meant to be like an encyclopedia, a who's who of the cantina, and I hope that you enjoy it. If you do enjoy this kind of thing, then you were probably that one kid in every class who liked to sit around and read the dictionary. Each entry will begin with a look at 6 important categories. Number 1, species. This one is like it sounds like. Number 2, production nickname. Most cantina customers had a name or names that the artists and crew referred to them by, some lovingly, some not. Number 3, name origin. This one is interesting because up until this point, we haven't really referred to any of these guys by their official names, and you'll be surprised at the way that many of these names came about. Some aren't even that official and were just sort of adopted into the canon by default. There are a few sources for these names that will keep popping up as we go along, so here are 3 that you should know. The 1978 memo. This document was first mentioned in an article on the official site in 2003. It is a memo sent from Lucasfilm to Kenner Toys, dated September 13, 1978. Kenner had only just recently, belatedly, begun cranking out Star Wars action figures and, as they had struck pure gold, were eager to produce more characters. In their zeal, they sent word to Lucasfilm requesting the names of the characters in the cantina. Unfortunately, what they got back was mediocre and rushed, and it's really a good thing that none of these names became permanent. Otherwise, we would be referring to the Cantina band members today as Sickmoo and Walrus Man as Rustwall, which of course is just a reversal of the syllables of the words music and walrus, which is just weak and embarrassing. The Star Wars role-playing game. This game was created and published by West End Games, who published over 100 books and modules beginning in 1987 and continuing until they lost the license in 1997 or 98. In their publications, specifically their Galaxy Guides, they were among the very first to go back and assign names and races to characters we only got fleeting glimpses of, but wanted to know more about. The Star Wars Customizable Card Game, or CCG, was published by Decipher Incorporated and was produced from 1995 to 2001. In the thousands of cards that they published during those years, they created names for scores of background characters and aliens that even West End Games had skipped over. Some of these names turned out to be sneaky references too, as we will see. Okay, returning to our list of 6 important categories for every entry. Number 4, designed, sculpted by. Number 5, actor. For both of these, specific details are not always available 100% of the time, and sometimes even the official sources are wrong, so we will do our best. Number 6, action figure. Just as it says, we will show you if an action figure has been produced for the character in question. You would think that in over 40 years of toys, at least all of the major aliens would have been addressed by now, but you'd be wrong. Lastly, one final word before we dive in, and that is on the subject of pronunciations. Keep in mind that some of these names have never been spoken aloud in any official Star Wars media, and never will be. Therefore, they are subject to the ear of the beholder, so your mileage may vary. I am going to be attempting them, but give me a break here. There are going to be some doozies. Athelo. This alien can be distinguished from his counterpart because he does not wear a neck scarf. Another way to distinguish him is that Athelo is completely bald on top of his head, while his counterpart, Onelco, has short, curly hair, much like the snaggletooth named Takil. It's interesting to point out, but apparently for the aliens made by Stuart Freeborn's crew, it is customary for all species to dress alike, as we will see. This mask was apparently minorly redressed and used in the Star Wars Holiday Special and made into the character Salamahal. It was also used as a background alien on Cloud City named Triva Horm. Ponda Baba. Parts of StarWars.com points out that the famous jackets used in the first film, worn by Walrus Man, Ceremonial Luke Skywalker, and others, are actually British racing jackets that have been dyed and modified. You can see a photo of the actual jacket that Luke wore at the end of the film at sciencefictionarchives.com. They go on to explain that Walrus Man's blaster pistol was made from a rifle, an AR-7 Explorer, manufactured by Charter Arms. The assembly from a British mortar shell was added to the barrel, as well as a scope. Apparently the prop weapon never had a finished handle, which was probably because the actor was wearing the pod-type alien hands. The mask was later freshened up and used in the Star Wars Holiday Special, and again in Return of the Jedi as a background alien for Jabba's palace. It was displayed in 2014, looking rather rough. Chal Bakan, or Beacon. No photographic proof exists that a second Plutonian costume was ever made, so included here for completeness is this character invented by Decipher for the Star Wars customizable card game. It is indeed true that this alien appears to be in two places at once the way the scene is edited, but as the scene took several days to film and the actors tended to move around, it is actually Nabran Leeds that is seen twice. Mosep Benid. There are two of these aliens in the cantina and also seen wandering the streets of Mos Eisley. They have completely different hair. This alien's hair is white and he sports a topknot. This mask was also used again in Return of the Jedi in Jabba's courtroom, where it's been decided that it's one and the same character. As for action figures, Hasbro released an excellent one in 2015. Boalo. You can see this guy's pointy hat in the background of the cantina, but we have to turn to the Jabba the Hutt scene from the special edition to get a complete look at him. He is one of Jabba the Hutt's 3 human henchmen, so we will put him in the category of pirate. Dans Borin. There are indeed 4 spacemen in the cantina, and this is the only one that we can see up close for a brief moment very early in the scene. This is also the only one that we can tell is really human. John Malo's chart called for 4 spacemen and 3 star pilots, and instead of constructing costumes, the crew apparently used what was available. We will discuss this subject further with the later spacemen. Dans Borin, whose name, as many of Decipher's, must be an as-yet unsolved anagram, is actually wearing a spacesuit from the 1971 film Escape from the Planet of the Apes, as does one of the 2 Duros, although these spacesuits were actually made for a Jerry Lewis movie called Way, Way Out in 1966, where they were silver. The helmet is unidentified as of yet. Boshek. Boshek is an important character because he is the person who refers Obi-Wan to Chewbacca. Strangely, for a visible minor character who performs an important function, the actor's name was lost to the general public for decades. We should probably put him into the group of 3 star pilots that are listed on the John Malo chart we looked at in Chapter 1, but who are the others? This gets difficult because the line between that category and spacemen can get a little blurry. Now let's talk about his spacesuit. If it looks familiar to you, it should. It is a Windac high-altitude pressure suit used by the Royal Air Force in the 1960s. In fact, in the very same cantina, Spaceman No. 2 that we're going to look at later is wearing a yellow one, which will later be the costume for the bounty hunter Bosk. For a while, these suits were popping up in science fiction films of all kinds, and there are many examples of other colors in the original Star Wars trilogy. In the Power of the Jedi line, Hasbro made an excellent action figure of him in 2001. Bureaucrat. The bad news is we cannot see this person very well, but the good news is we now know who he is and what category he belongs in. The Cantina panel at Star Wars Celebration 2015 showed the audience that the actor's name is Isaac Grand. The photo of production notes lists 2 local bureaucrats, which was down from the original number of 3, and gives us their names, the second of which we will see when we get to the M's. Swilla Corey. This is one of 2 local girls in the cantina, and the easiest place to see this character is behind Obi-Wan after his fight at the bar. Deb Noli. Although he sits pretty prominently at the front of the cantina, nothing much is known about this character. He wears a striped robe that looks like something out of an Old Testament play. We know now that he is not one of the 2 bureaucrats, but what category does he belong to? Farmer, perhaps? Damono Diomeli. This poor guy was called Little Aunt Beru for years by fans because the name was written on John Malo's chart as a possible part for Gilda Cohen. Luckily, he finally got his official name at Star Wars Celebration in 2015. Dr. Cornelius Evazan. Several Cantina actors were hired through London's Ugly Models, an agency that specializes in unique people, and still does to this day. Alfie Curtis was one such actor, and here we can see him without the Dr. Evazan makeup. Here is his original listing in the Ugly Agency catalog. This original latex facial appliance still exists and is in the Kurtz Joyner archive. Here one is being applied by makeup artist Charles Parker. Partsofstarwars.com points out that Evazan's blaster pistol was made from a Rexam Favor submachine gun with 2 scopes and various other parts added. After a couple of half-hearted attempts, Hasbro finally gave us an excellent Evazan figure in the vintage collection. Greedo, I know how to say that one. The documentary Star Wars Begins notes that Stuart Freeborn based Greedo off of the Peapod alien, which Freeborn had designed for a TV commercial for frozen vegetables. As we have seen, there were 3 complete Martian costumes made for the film. All 3 were used for the cut Jabba scene, despite Greedo having been killed minutes before. Greedo's jumpsuit is made from a British racing uniform, with the top half being the very same type of jacket we've already discussed. In the American filmed scenes, not only is Maria de Aragon wearing Duros hands, but the orange vest that she wears is slightly different also. Greedo's snub-nosed blaster pistol is a modified Ruger Mark I Model T678 with additional items glued to it, including the barrel, which is made from model airplane engines. Its fate had long been wondered about until this author discovered quite by accident what happened to it. "I had the gun for years," Paul Blake told me in 2018. "My kids played with it. They actually broke it and I threw it away. And now I wish I hadn't. But nobody knew that more than 40 years on we would be sitting here talking about Star Wars all these years later." Greedo's mask is in the Kurtz Joyner archive, and a pair of Rhodian hands are in the collection of master designer and prop restoration expert Tom Spina. One of the Rhodian costumes was used in the Star Wars Holiday Special, as we will see in Chapter 9, and again in Return of the Jedi as a character named Beto. After the initial Kenner action figure in 1978, Hasbro has produced several other Greedo figures over the years. Paul Blake said, "Every year, a new one of me comes out. They love me." Hetnikik and unnamed Jawas. There is at least one other Jawa in the cantina. When the scene begins, the camera pans across the room, revealing 2 pairs of glowing eyes on the right side of the screen. Also, there are 2 more Jawas on their way in when Han Solo is leaving, so that's probably 4. Jenny. Like the first local girl, the second is tough to spot in the cantina, but she is there, sitting with one of the other Rhodians. In the Lost Cut version, she is sitting with Han Solo and is even seen kissing him. She is still there when Chewbacca brings Obi-Wan and Luke to Han's table, and Han has to ask her to leave. This photo is not only a very good picture of this character in color, but on the right side you can see a couple of unmasked spacemen in the back. Danik Jericho. This alien is very easy to spot as he stands at the very front of the bar. The panel at Star Wars Celebration 2015 revealed that the actor playing the Smoker also came from the Ugly Agency. It seems very unlikely that in modern times an action figure would be produced that included a hookah as an accessory, even if it's a space hookah, and actually would appear on store shelves, but it happened in 2005. Hide the children. Cabe. This cute little guy is hardly tall enough to reach the bar, and he squeaks in desperation as the bartender hands him a drink. He looks friendly, but perhaps that wasn't always the case. As we saw in Chapter 1, early versions of the script refer to one of Luke's attackers as being a rodent, and this is retained even up to the novelization and final script, where there are still 3 attackers. Even if you think this description could refer to the Ranat alien, you have to admit neither one of them would have made as formidable an adversary as Walrus Man. Both Cabe and the rat alien's hands were reused from the 2001 A Space Odyssey ape costumes, which Stuart Freeborn had also created, and this was a time saver for his team. The original mask can be seen today at sciencefictionarchives.com. Cabe has been immortalized twice in Hasbro plastic, the first time in a 2-pack with Muftak, which was a Kenner exclusive, and the second time in a 2-pack with Nabron Leeds, which was sold in stores in 2006. Herchek and Saitor Kalfas. You're killing me. Another fantastic alien design from Stuart Freeborn, the Saurans as they would come to be known, are said to be cousins. The one named Saitor is a female. They stand close together near the end of the bar where they won't miss seeing anyone who happens to come through the front door. One of the Sauron masks was repurposed into the bounty hunter Bosk for The Empire Strikes Back, and the other was used again in Return of the Jedi as a background alien in Jabba's palace, seen here on the sail barge. The untouched mask still exists and is owned by a participant of sciencefictionarchives.com. A fantastic action figure was produced by Hasbro, but for some reason they went all Bosk with the eyes and made them golden, which doesn't even match the artwork on the card, so you'll have to repaint them if you value accuracy in your Cantina diorama. Kidikkeedkak. Okay, this name is ridiculous. I get that they're going for the sound an insect makes, but somebody somewhere is laughing at you when you try to say it. This alien is hidden in the very back of the room on the right side of the bar, and was operated from within by Jack Purvis like a giant puppet. The original color of the creature was bright green, although any Hasbro action figure is always brown. Taus Ka. This alien is the counterpart to Mosep, and he sits on the left side of the cantina at the table that Lisub Serlin is standing in front of. For a while there was some confusion over which alien was Mosep, but the release of the Hasbro action figure finally settled that question. Most old school fans know this alien as Jabba the Hutt from the original Marvel Comics. We will see this Hutt with 1T in Chapter 10 when we look at Cantina Comics. Both Nimbinil aliens can be seen walking the streets of Mos Eisley, distinguishable by their hair. In these photos you can see both of them at the same time. Also note that R2-D2 is in two places at once, which is a clever filming trick that you don't pick up on in the finished product. Garuf Lafaux. There isn't much to say about this guy other than the fact that he runs and finds the nearest sand troopers when trouble breaks out, prompting them to enter the cantina. He was played by stuntman Peter Diamond, who also played the attacking Tusken Raider and a handful of other smaller roles in the film. Nabran Leeds. This four-armed Plutonian is one of the most conspicuous aliens in the cantina, besides being in two places at once at the start of the scene, as we have talked about. This alien wears another British racing suit, and the gas mask, manufactured by Avon Technical Products, was World War II surplus. Apparently, it cannot breathe oxygen, so you really have to wonder how it's able to enjoy the drink in his hand. The original mask and a pair of hands reside in the collection of Tom Spina, as well as the packing crates for both Nabran Leeds and a Snaggletooth. A Nabran Leeds action figure has been issued on two different occasions, but wouldn't he make an awesome Black Series figure? Erik Johansson. Now we play the difficult game of trying to fill some of the incomplete categories with some of the more obscure extras in the cantina. This gentleman stands beside the Tonica sisters, and he wears a white or light-colored tunic shirt that is similar to other citizens of Tatooine, therefore he could be a local farmer. Some fans believe that he should be given the name Erik Johansson because of a story from the 1995 book Tales from the Mos Eisley Cantina. His decipher card says Moisture Farmer. Local Ugly Man. In the Lost Cut, this guy is hanging out with a Snaggletooth named Takil. In the finished cantina scene, he is easier to see standing behind Obi-Wan after the incident involving Walrus Man, looking on in amazement. The panel at Star Wars Celebration of Anaheim in 2015 revealed the actor's name, who it was thought probably came from the Ugly Agency. Local Ugly Man. Again revealed because of the Star Wars Celebration in Anaheim, it was noted that this extra of various British films agreed to shave his mustache to appear in the film. But, as you can see from the photo, he showed up for filming without having done so. This image is from the Lost Cut, as this guy is not very identifiable in the finished edit of the scene. This is the only one of the four local ugly men who does not seem to have any sort of prosthetic nose or facial appliance. Yurka Mig. Bless that 2015 Star Wars Celebration Cantina panel, because when they unearthed this actor's name in the production notes, we now know that he is actually a bureaucrat. He is most noticeable when Han Solo throws the bartender a coin as he's exiting, and it's hard to miss his specially dyed British racing jacket. Interestingly, you can spot this very same jacket on a couple of different extras in the streets of Mos Eisley. As it turns out, George Stock was another actor who played more than one part in Star Wars. He is also one of the robed rebel leaders at the end of the film, standing in the background in the scene where the heroes receive their medals, but virtually impossible to see in the finished film. Well, I was afraid of that. It's simply too much goodness for one video to contain. Tune in next time for the... We interrupt this video with breaking news. As this very video was being completed, Hasbro, out of the blue, made a surprise announcement that the next HasLab crowd-funded product for the Vintage Collection would be a modular and movie-accurate playset of the Mos Eisley Cantina for the first time in recorded history. And hey, somebody over there finally figured out that there are no bar stools in the cantina. What's more, not only does it come with a brand new sculpt of the bartender, but also, for the first time anywhere, a day that fans were told would never come. Actual action figures of the Tonica sisters. It finally got worked out. And for completeness, some bonuses can be reached. If 11,000 backers are reached, also included will be a new Greedo. I guess so. If they reach 14,000 backers, we get a brand new super articulated Nabran Leeds. And if the rather unlikely number of 17,000 backers is reached, the Wolfman with the light-up eyes. By the time we reach Chapter 8 for our look at Cantina Playsets, we should know if this project has become a reality, so we will keep you posted. I don't have to tell you where I stand on this one. Sure, $500 is expensive, but so was the sail barge and that got made. I've already bought mine. We now return to our regularly scheduled video already in progress. The rest of the Elstree Cantina customers, and we'll save you a booth. Welcome back to our A to Z examination of every alien and human in the original London Cantina. We last left off in the letter N, and also, before we begin, Cabe is a girl. Niche. This Rhodian is seen at the very beginning of the Cantina scene, and it appears he is sitting with Dan Sporen, but he's actually at a table in front of him. This also happens to be the Rhodian who is sitting with Jenny. If you look carefully at this photo, you will see that he is not wearing the standard issue orange Rhodian vest. He does regain it somehow for the Jabba the Hutt scene. What's more, Paul Blake indicated to this author that at one point he was the one sitting at Jenny's table. Further proof that there was a lot of moving around in the cantina over those days of filming. In our Greedo entry, it was mentioned that one costume was used in Return of the Jedi as the background character Beto, but it should be noted that a second costume also appeared in Jabba's palace, as a Rhodian named Revid Jassa. Onelco. The second of these aliens in the cantina is a little slimmer than his counterpart, Athelo, and is discernible by the scarf or ascot that he wears. Originally named Solamahal, a feature in Star Wars Insider number 130 changed this alien's name back to Onelco, and established that the other is a different alien entirely, who has completely different hair anyway. Ront Birnlu. All three pirates are tricky to spot in the cantina, but they are there. For this big guy, just look for the beard. You can better see their costumes away from the crowd in the Jabba scene. Formerly called Davelin Shmi by fans, this pirate was given his name at Star Wars Celebration in 2017 from a combination of the actor's name with fan Brian Lewis. Regesk. We really only get one glimpse of this creature in the cantina, sitting between a Jawa and Zutton the Snaggletooth. Then, not too long after that, a tall rat creature is seen walking the Mos Eisley streets. Decipher gave this second one the name of Nevar Yalnal, but there's no proof that it's not also Regesk, other than some fans think that the second one is too tall. Once again, the actor for the street scenes could be a different person entirely. Rykar Rygerd. Best I can do. Standing at the front of the bar beside Nabron Leeds is this little guy, who is wearing a vest with a red collar or possibly a hood over it. At some point, a short scene of him encountering a super tall creature with stilt legs in a Mos Eisley alleyway was going to be used for comic relief. Instead, the outtake appeared in the introduction to the Star Wars Holiday Special's Cantina scene. Interestingly, this scene would have kept going with our friend pulling a tiny gun on the towering attacker, as this rare production slide shows. Lisub Serlin. In the chart made by John Mallow, it looked like this alien would have a brain-like head. In Stuart Freeborn's concept art, it looked like she would have lots of facial tattoos or markings, and that a mohawk was the hairstyle of choice at one point. In the end, this pink lady ended up with unusual braids over a large egg head. This seemed to be one of those characters that would never become an action figure in a million years, but it happened. Spaceman number 2. This and Spaceman number 1, Dan Sporen, are the two easiest spacemen in the cantina to see. He wears a yellow Windac pressure suit, in fact the same one that will become the costume for the bounty hunter Bosk. This suit was on hand at the studio and was from the 1964 film First Men in the Moon. It had also appeared in an episode of the Doctor Who story The 10th Planet. It's possible that the helmet is original as well, but it's hard to tell with what we can see. Spaceman number 3, and Spaceman number 4. The last two spacemen are identically dressed, so where did their spacesuits come from? There was a fan theory that each spaceman's costume was purposefully constructed to pay tribute to vintage science fiction TV shows or movies, but this isn't the case. One of the films often suggested is George Pal's Destination Moon. As you can see, the spacesuits from that film are very unique, and even if you could change their color, you couldn't disguise the oversized accordion folds at the knees and elbows. There aren't any spacesuits in the Cantina that match these. Another title thrown around is Lost in Space, and researching that trail yielded some interesting findings. This is Penny Robinson's suit from the show. Even though most photos of our spacemen are in black and white, you can sometimes make out the distinctive red piping that these suits had if you look closely. This photo is color-coded and makes distinguishing the four spacemen much easier, and is clear enough that you can make out the red piping on spaceman number 3's sleeve. What would be interesting to know is how these suits ended up at Elstree. The helmets, with their large bubble-like viewers, were from Escape from the Planet of the Apes. As to the actors, unfortunately all we know is that one of them was named Chris Bunn. Merc Sunlet. This human is easiest to see in the Cantina after the fight with Walrus Man and Dr. Evazan. He is one of the baffled onlookers behind Ben Kenobi. That is all. Takil. Like many freeborn aliens, there is a pair of these in the Cantina. They are nearly identical in their clothes, and even in their hunched backs, but are distinguishable by their hair. Takil has a full head of curly hair, while Zutton, who we will see shortly, does not. Takil can also be seen limping along the streets of Mos Eisley. Amazingly, his mask was featured in a November 1977 Vogue magazine pictorial on, of all things, fur? Kenner's famous blue snaggletooth was, as you probably know, not only a famous mistake, but a Sears exclusive. The red snaggletooth followed, but that figure was probably intended to be the snaggletooth from the Star Wars Holiday Special, who was named Zutmore in the show. Hasbro has made 3 since the late 1990s. One was specifically named Takil in a 3-pack. One new version of the blue snaggletooth as a joke in a notoriously difficult to find Kmart exclusive 3-pack, and a splendid but generically named Snaggletooth in a 3-pack exclusive to Target. Thuku. Thuku is said to be the Rhodian walking the streets of Mos Eisley that we see shortly after Greedo's death, which confused many a small child at the time, this author included. All 3 Martian costumes made a return appearance as part of Jabba's gang for the cut scene later reinstated for the special edition. Almost immediately after Greedo is killed, said Paul Blake, you see another one that looks just like me. I said, George, some people are going to find it confusing, and he said, it's no matter, all Rhodians look alike. The Tonica Sisters. No Cantina diorama would be complete without them, but for years it was said that Hasbro would never be able to produce action figures of them. Why is this? Angela Staines revealed in a 2017 podcast interview that she had never signed away her likeness rights, making her a rarity among Star Wars actors. Add to that the fact that her husband wrote Lucasfilm a very angry letter over the use of the Tonica sisters' image on a Decipher CCG game card in 1995, and the chances were not looking good. However, all of this is apparently now resolved, as fans backing the HasLab Cantina playset have a chance to own the first ever Tonica sisters action figures. At the time of this video, it's more than half backed, so stay tuned. Tzivzit. Great, another bug name. Zizvit, which I imagine is supposed to be bzzzt. Another unique alien from Stuart Freeborn's team, this character is much easier to see in the original rough cut of the Cantina scene. However, he is still in the final film if you know where to look. When the Sand Troopers first enter the Cantina and are gathering information, he is one of the aliens being questioned, although I can't imagine how that would work. Today, the original mask resides in the collection of Tom Spina. Unknown Patrons, number 1 and 2. Now we begin a special category, the Unknowns group. In some of the black and white wide shots that exist of the Cantina set, there are a handful of people who are never seen again. They are usually in the farthest, darkest corners of the photos and are barely visible. So, who are they? Here are the possibilities as I see it. Number 1. extras that were only there for certain days of filming. This theory probably doesn't hold water, as Lucas wanted a crowded cantina from the start, and the more extras you dismiss, the more your shots won't match up later. Number 2. Existing actors who have removed their masks or helmets. This is at least possible, especially if they are costumes we can't get a very good look at to begin with. Number 3. Members of the crew or visitors. This is a better possibility, especially if the photos were done between takes. Here we have 2 men that are seen standing together, so we will look at them at the same time. They are standing in the back leftmost corner of the room, just in front of the doorway to that back room that we discussed in Chapter 3. Here is a full shot of the man on the left who looks like he is wearing a coat with a hood. Neither of these guys are the unnamed hiding man that we will see in a little while either, because he is noticeable in these photos. What do you think, folks at home? Unknown woman. Going back to our color-coded spaceman photo from earlier, this woman is seen right in the middle of them. She is sitting at the table with spaceman number 2 in the yellow flight suit and talking to Lisa Serlin. It is definitely not Jenny, because Jenny is in the same photo. The website Star Wars Aficionado published this photo, which is one of Ann Skinner's on-set continuity photos. Even though it is a little washed out, we can now see that this woman has earrings and a shawl, and that she is definitely a unique Cantina patron. Let's zoom in and increase the contrast, which is about as good as we're going to get. This photo is also notable because it shows us the faces for 2 of the spacemen. Unnamed bureaucrat or farmer, number 1. We have already identified the 2 bureaucrats who were mentioned in production notes, but we need a way to refer to these next 2 unknowns. Admittedly, they could be just about anything. This bald man sits near the front of the cantina and can be easily seen at the left side of the screen as Han Solo is leaving. Unnamed bureaucrat or farmer, number 2. This second unknown man has his back turned in every single photo he appears in, where he is actually talking to unknown patrons 1 and 2 that we saw a minute ago. From our viewpoint, his outfit looks very much like the uniform of an Imperial officer, as was pointed out in our Chapter 1 video. All I can say for certain is that he's not either one of these guys, because they are present in the same photos that he is in. Unnamed star pilot. This man sits prominently with Deb Noley at the front of the cantina. It would make sense that he is one of the star pilots, but admittedly, he could also be almost anything. He wears one of the cool British racing jackets like Ponda Baba and Yurka Mig. Unnamed hiding man. An article on the official website several years ago pointed this poor guy out, who apparently just does not want to be seen. He's located on the left side of the bar, crammed behind the giant pirate Ront Brynloo and the wall. His dark, high-parted hair is sometimes all you can see. He definitely isn't one of the unknown patrons we have discussed either, because he can be seen in those same photos. Whoever he is, he needs to fire his agent. Wyoslea, or Wyoslea, or Wyosley, one of those. You have to admit, this is either the bravest or the stupidest alien design of all time. As it turns out, we do have somebody to blame for it, and it's George Lucas. In all the drafts of the script, including the final, released to the public published version, Luke's primary attacker at the bar is, quote, a large, multiple-eyed creature who instigates the fight. At some point in the proceedings of production, Walrus Man was invented, and it was decided that he filled this role much better, as he looked much more aggressive and, well, not this. So Lucas came up with the idea, but who is to blame for the design of this alien? Well, that was George too. Nick Maley, who was part of the Stuart Freeborn team, said, George came in with a drawing of a multi-eyed blob creature that he'd done while sitting in the airport, and yeah, we built it, and we all hated it. And so this alien was relegated to the role of land speeder dealer instead, and with the hood up, she looks kind of mysterious in the film. However, she is hard to find in the cantina unless you were watching the Lost Cut version. In 2009, Hasbro amazingly gave us an action figure of this alien. Now, there has long been a rumor that early versions were packaged with a lightsaber, and this is not exactly true. Instead, it was in some Hasbro production photography for that wave of figures, where she is pictured holding a blue lightsaber. Apparently somebody over there thought this alien was part of the Geonosis arena battle or something. The bartender. Incidentally, what is the correct pronunciation of the bartender's name? Another client of the Ugly Agency, actor Ted Burnett, was well cast as the surly bartender of the cantina. We do not get to hear his real voice in the movie, but the dubbed one does work pretty well. It was many years before an action figure of this character was made, even though he is one of the most integral and necessary figures to any cantina. And when the Star Wars Holiday Special came out, we learned that the cantina had not one, but two bartenders, the other being B. Arthur? We'll get to that in Chapter 9. Gela Yeens. The third of Jabba the Hutt's henchmen stands near the back of the left side of the bar. He also moves around the cantina quite a bit. He has distinctive sideburns, wears a hat with goggles, and sports a tan vest. Zutton. This poor guy is not only a hunchback, but his male pattern baldness is out of control. It does make him easy to identify, though. One of the easiest places to see him is when Han leaves the cantina. Zutton sits at a table with Mosep. One of the two Snaggletooth masks was overhauled to become Zutmore in the Star Wars Holiday Special, and then became a background alien in Cloud City, and then became a background character in Jabba's palace named Gizem. It seems like the second original Snaggletooth mask has disappeared. Well, that completes the original population of the cantina, so that wraps it up, right? Nope. Hold on to your drinks, it's about to get a lot more crowded. Welcome back. In case you were just joining us, upon viewing the cantina scene as originally completed, George Lucas felt it could be better, and hired Rick Baker, who assembled a team to create additional aliens to be filmed separately and edited into the existing scene. To save time, Baker supplemented the masks his team created with several from his own personal inventory that he had previously made. The idea was to use these as background characters, but to his dismay, several ended up being front and center, which caused some issues later on. In total, Baker and his team contributed 25 new creatures that made it into the film, which were used to portray somewhere around 29 different aliens. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Brakaner Bakiska. This particular individual was actually a remold of another Baker donation, the Terminal Man, or Trento Duwaba, as we will see shortly. To change it up, though, somebody added a droopy and ridiculous mustache. He lurks at a table behind the Wolfman, Brainiac, and the Don Rickles alien. This photo provides us a better look at his costume, which is a long tan robe worn over a long brown tunic. For years, he was jokingly called Fu Manchu by fans, but at Star Wars Celebration 6 in 2012, he was given an official name using that of a fan who won a contest, and combining it with the names of Lane Liska and Rick Baker. Cantina Band Member, Backing Band. It's hard to imagine the cantina scene without the iconic design of this alien. Sculpted by Doug Beswick and modified from Rick Baker's original design, the Cantina Band became instant representatives for Star Wars all over the world. As we mentioned, in the film though, it's impossible to count how many members the band actually has. Note this photo, which shows all 7 sets of masks and hands that Baker's team produced. Over the years, different toys, playsets, and artwork have attributed varying numbers of members to the Cantina Band, commonly 5 or 6, but to settle the question once and for all, you just have to find the right photograph. Here there are 2 background band members that can be hard to see. Some photos give you the suggestion of a shoulder, and one background member is definitely seated. The band member seated at Muftak's table, named Liren Karin, is simply a reused mask. Here are the names of the backing band members in the film. As you can see, Biths love apostrophes. Today, one of the original band member masks is in the collection of legendary actor and archivist Bob Burns. Cantina Band Member, Figrin Dan. The leader of the band, which is called the Modal Nodes, was actually named several years before his bandmates. In the Star Wars Holiday Special, he was referred to by the name Barbarine, which is another thing that we will see later. Action figures of the band have been produced several times. The first was a generic figure offered as a mail-away premium in 1997 that came with 5 different instruments, expecting you to buy multiples. Several others have followed, including a full set, as well as a 6-inch figurandan in the Black Series line, made the same year as an exclusive Nayland Cheel, who included the rest of the instruments, meaning that once again you had to buy duplicates to make the whole band, which was rather pricey. Liren Karin. In a clever move, one of the 7 band member masks was reused as a completely different table-filling alien. If you want an action figure of him, though, you will have to customize it yourself, although plenty of existing parts are available to do it. Lots of people think he is a member of the band despite his completely different attire. Even as a kid, I always believed he was probably the band's manager. Hem Dazon. Literally, the very first thing you see in the cantina scene is this guy, but actually, all you can see is all there ever was of this alien. He was operated as a hand puppet, and as photos show us, had a flashlight jammed into the back of his head so that his eyes would light up. In 1994, the Star Wars Screen Entertainment Screensaver software, remember those, named this alien Cal Nakai, before Weston Games changed it the following year. Hem is yet another Cantina alien that today resides in the collection of Bob Burns. Responding to fan requests, Hasbro produced an action figure of this character in 2006, but in my opinion, he just doesn't look right with a body. Trinto Duaba. One of Rick Baker's donated masks that predated Star Wars, this alien began life as a reimagining of the Frankenstein monster, which is evident by the contact points in his head, hence the nickname Terminal Man. Baker wore it himself to a Halloween party he attended with his wife. It worked well for a background character in Lucas's project, and was also copied to make the Fu Manchu alien Braconner Bakiska, which increased the total number of masks that Baker's team was able to produce in a limited time period. In 2008, Hasbro killed 2 birds with 1 stone when they gave surprised fans a 2-pack that included Trinto Duaba and Dice Ibagon. Gyros number 3. Since we are going in alphabetical order, this alien comes up first, before his other Duros brethren. Since this patron is apparently a separate character, he should be included here. Visible over Greedo's shoulder during his confrontation with Han Solo is a table with 2 Cantina patrons, Mayo and a Duros. Mayo appears to be dressed the same as his appearance in a side alcove. However, this Duros is not dressed like either of the pair we see engrossed in conversation in a corner of the cantina. This third one is wearing the same jacket as the Wolfman, Arlael Schaus, and has alien hands rather than human ones. Godel number 2. Extra mileage was gotten out of the Godel mask during the filming at Dovington Studio. Besides the Godel we are most familiar with, known as Feltapern Travag, who is in a booth with Skullhead and Yamnose, Besides the Godel we are most familiar with, named Feltapern Travag, who is in a booth with Skullhead and Yamnose, this second, unnamed Godel sits in Hammerhead's booth, with his back to the camera. It wears a completely different outfit, complete with a uniform-style coat, and, actually, blue jeans, which were never intended to be seen, of course. Godel number 3. Yet another Godel was put together, to do a walkthrough behind the close-ups of Greedo that were filmed. The Cantina panel at Star Wars Celebration 2015 showed how all of his wardrobe was reused. This Godel utilized the tan robe from Terminal Man, the brown overcoat from Yamnose, the Godel mask, as well as the Godel hands, which, by the way, were remolded from Rick Baker's Demon Baby hands from 1974's It's Alive, and then covered in fur. Here is what the full-length ensemble looked like, and here is what it looked like on screen. Ellis Hellrot. This unusual alien was created by Ralph McQuarrie and is not even seen in the finished film, but he is really there, at the table with the named Godel, Feltapern Travag, and Yamnose. Even stranger, for an unseen alien, he also appears to have a unique set of hands, which was something of a rarity among Cantina aliens. Fans were lucky and surprised that Hasbro made an action figure of him in the 30th anniversary collection in 2007. Dice Ibagon. One thing Rick Baker's team provided Lucas with was an excellent variety of alien types, among them this snake-like creature that surprises the viewer and gives the Cantina an atmosphere of unpredictability. Notice the tubes coming from the alien. In this photo, where Phil Tippett is manipulating the puppet, you can see they are connected to a cylinder. The original plan was for this alien to exude some sort of apparently red goo, which George Lucas decided against during filming as being a bit too sensational. The original puppet was sold in a 2011 auction at the Prop Store website. Of course, the creature had to be fleshed out a bit in order to provide us with an action figure, and as we said, he came in a 2-pack with Trinto Duaba. Banis Keeg. The Duros are a famous pair of aliens designed by Ron Cobb and brought to life by Baker's team, notably Phil Tippett, and as we have seen, there were actually 3 characters made from the 2 masks. Banis Keeg wears clothes similar to a Tatooine resident. Only one set of Duros hands are in the film at any given time, and here they are worn by Keeg. Now, what is this alien's actual name? Follow me if you can. In 1993, West End Games' Galaxy Guide 7 mentioned a Duros named Chachi Damal. In 1994, the Star Wars Screen Entertainment screensaver software named this alien Probos. Then, in 1995, Decipher names this alien Banis Keeg in their Star Wars customizable card game. Then, an article in 2001 suggests that this alien is Chachi Damal and is female and is married to the second Duros. Ironically, Ron Cobb, on the original concept art, wrote of this creature, "Nothing known." Labria. This mask was another that Rick Baker pulled from his own personal inventory. There is evidence that it might have been created for the John Landis movie Schlock. Today, the original mask is in the collection of, you guessed it, Bob Burns. In 1995, the book Tales from the Mos Eisley Cantina said that Labria's name was an alias for Cardu Sai Malak, although Hasbro completely ignored this when an action figure was made in 1998 and again in 2006. Pons Limbic. Decipher first named this character as Brainiac, and, perhaps because DC Comics already had a long-standing character by that name, he was completely renamed when his action figure came out. His costume is vintage, from an Old Republic serial called Spy Smasher, a character ironically owned by, wait for it, DC Comics. This is another mask that is owned today by Bob Burns. An action figure was released in the Legacy Collection, and he included a Cantina table, which ensured that multiples would be purchased. Elors Medak. This Duros wears a spacesuit from Escape from the Planet of the Apes, like the spaceman Dan Sporen who we looked at before. He also has human hands, which are in gloves, a fact that Hasbro completely missed for their action figure. Like Banis Keeg, there was an attempt in 2001 to rename this alien as Owen Damal, husband to Chachi, who we talked about earlier. The 1994 screensaver software named this alien Bringe. One Duros mask was used again in Return of the Jedi as a background alien in Jabba's palace, later named Laslomi Tessima by Decipher. In 2011, one Duros mask and a pair of hands were attempted to be sold in auction, but did not reach the reserve price, and later were offered again in October of 2016. This time the mask had been repaired, and the photos give us a rare look at what the inside of a Cantina mask looks like. Muftak. This adorable head-scratching Cantina monster was realized as the upper half of a costume only. He sits with Liren Karin, Jasper, and Mayo in an alcove of their own. Bob Burns is a very lucky man to own this costume, and in 2017 it was cleaned, restored, and repaired by Tom Spina, which is detailed on his website. Unbelievably, there has only been one Muftak action figure so far, and that was in an exclusive mail-order 2-pack from 1998, where he was paired with his best friend Cabe, who is a girl. Mayo. This strange Cyclops alien was designed by Lane Liska, and the mask appeared again in the Star Wars Holiday Special, where his eye is closed and stays that way until he is thrown out of the cantina. Hasbro has produced one Mayo action figure in the original trilogy collection in 2005. Momon Nadon, but he'll always be Hammerhead to me. One of the most brilliant and inspired designs in the entire Cantina, Ron Cobb's remarkable concept art for this alien is very detailed. Titled Aquatic Air Breather Amphibian, the diagrams show 2 head positions for swimming, labeled Hunting and Long Distance Swimming. In the corner are diagrams of the creature's hands with the following text. Feeds by passing plankton-bearing water through mouth slits and out lower neck openings. Brain in hump at base of neck. Speaks through implanted transmitter to external voice box on chest. Very gentle. Has religion based on tying and untying knots in cords. From the Phil Tippett items auctioned off in October of 2016, here are 2 pages of diagrams by John Berg showing eye mechanism designs for Hammerhead. A list shows some items that would be needed for the mechanisms, including eye forms, brass tube, fish cable, springs, and finger splints. It took both John Berg and Phil Tippett to operate Hammerhead as a large half-body puppet. John Berg said about the famous creature he sculpted, "It appears in close-up. There really was a lot more to it. We shot a lot of stuff with it, and I don't think you could really tell exactly what it was without a longer cut. I don't think that was the pacing that George wanted to use for it, and that's why it's in there so briefly." A few Hammerhead action figures have been made over the years, with a slick-looking 6-inch figure being added to the Black Series line in the near future. Mayum Oneth. It's easy to see how this ugly alien got its nickname, as it really does look like a freshly dug-up vegetable. The mask was used again in Return of the Jedi as a background alien for Jabba's palace, and then somewhere slipped Lucasfilm's grasp because it was sold in an auction in 2011. According to the book Tales from the Mos Eisley Cantina, this alien is female and you do not want to date her. Hasbro made an action figure once in the 30th anniversary collection. Jasper. Not much is known about this throwaway alien. We do know the name is pronounced Jasper because he is named after a Decipher employee's cat. The same mask was either repainted or remolded for a flesh-colored version of this alien used in the Star Wars Holiday Special. Hasbro made an action figure around the time of Episode 2. Arliel Schaus. This Cantina patron has a history. This is one of the pre-existing masks that Rick Baker added to the numbers of what he and his team produced. Apparently invented to be sold at conventions or as a mail-order item, he first wore it in the Bob Burns 1974 Halloween extravaganza called Thing in the Attic. The mask was unusual for the time because it featured red eyes that really lit up, and Baker was shocked when the mask was used for a close-up in the film, as this wasn't his original intention. For our purposes here, this alien sits with Brainiac, Don Rickles, T-Head, and Fu Manchu in an alcove, and he wears the same jacket that was used for Duros number 3. He was also replaced by a CGI alien in the 1997 special edition. This is yet another original Cantina mask that resides in the collection of Bob Burns to this day. So far there is no action figure of him, but there is a remote possibility if the HasLab Cantina playset reaches 17,000 backers. Let's hope they produce him anyway. Lak Sivrak. The other Wolfman in the Cantina has a similar story in that Rick Baker took it from his shelf and added it to his team's output. He was equally surprised to see that it was used so prominently. George Lucas must have felt the same way because he also replaced this particular alien with the CGI one in the special edition, and yet we still got an action figure of him in 1998. Feltapern Travag. The only Godel with a name was nicknamed High Tundra because of Ron Cobb's notes, which referred to the alien's habitat. Cobb's notes went on to say that the creature was, quote, mammal-like, herbivore, excellent mechanic, very grumpy, smell bad. This Godel sits at a table with Yam Nose and Skullhead and is having a grand old time. Or, according to Tales from the Mos Eisley Cantina, he is putting the moves on Yam Nose. Ew. It didn't end well. Hasbro made an excellent action figure in 2005, but it cannot sit down due to its tunic design. Bomb Vimden. This alien was the voice of the beloved Mr. Potato Head in the Toy Story movie. Wait, sorry, that was the real Don Rickles. This scowling, foul-looking alien sits at Brainiac's table in the Cantina and wears a studded vest. Hasbro gave us a very well-done action figure of him in the Vintage collection. In closing, let's talk Cantina population numbers. We looked at 52 characters in our Elstree directory. This includes the unknowns that we looked at, but does not include Chal Bakan, who, after all, isn't real. Add to that 3 unnamed Jawas that we know of. This gives us a total of 55. Add to this the original aliens filmed at Dovington's, 20 original masks. This includes the 2 Duros and 7 sets of band member masks, plus 6 masks Rick Baker brought from home. Subtract Rungs, who was not used, gives us a total of 25. Add to that the reused masks, Duros number 3, Godel number 2, Godel number 3, and Lirin Karin, assuming Mayo is the same alien. This gives us a total of 29, which added to our Elstree number gives us 84. But wait, we're missing something because, after all, Han Solo and Chewbacca were there, giving us a grand total population of the Mos Eisley Cantina of 86. Thereabouts. Next time, is it true in the first year of marketing Star Wars that the Cantina all but disappeared? Maybe purposefully excluded? We'll take a look at the evidence and decide for ourselves if it's true. We'll see you then. After the Chapter 6 video was posted, which detailed all of the additional aliens filmed for the Cantina in Los Angeles in July of 1977, I received a few helpful comments, as well as one anonymous post to my blog, pointing out some of the missing information that has come to light in recent years and therefore was absent from the book. This led me in some new directions to research, and I unearthed enough that an update to the chapter was required, which will allow us to fill in some actors' names for most of the unknowns in that chapter, as well as correct some mistakes. Of course, if you're watching this in the playlist, this video will follow Chapter 6 where it belongs, so don't get confused. But before we do that, some kind viewers also pointed out in the comments that Godel number 2 and Godel number 3 had officially been named. Godel number 2, the Godel at Hammerhead's table, was given the name of Cobb Sonbapal at Star Wars Celebration in 2017, made from the name of a fan who was in attendance. Godel number 3, the Godel made to do walkthroughs behind Greedo's close-ups, was given the name of Hennett Kane at Star Wars Celebration in 2019, also based on the name of a fan who won a drawing. And now, on to replacing some of those unknown labels on some Chapter 6 aliens. Many of these have come to light only because more and more of the mask wearers have begun to sign photos at conventions in recent years. Penny McCarthy was a production assistant and assistant auditor on the first Star Wars film, and unfortunately passed away in 2020. Besides the Cantina aliens we are going to look at, she appeared in a couple of other pickup scenes filmed at Dovington's. Not only was she the Jawa that fits R2-D2 with a restraining bolt, she also played Princess Leia. Well, Princess Leia's hand, anyway, in a close-up. Come to think of it, this of course completely explains the presence of R2-D2 at Dovington's studio, which we saw in our Filming the Cantina chapter. For our purposes here, McCarthy wore the masks for the following aliens: Labria, Mayo, Feltapern Travag, which is just fun to say, and one Cantina band member, which we will come back to in a little while. She also signed photos for Lak Sivrak. This one can't be right though, since both he and Labria are around the very same table. At first I thought this was simply an error, and was supposed to be Arlael Schaus, who she also signed photos for. But this is not right either, because Kim Falkenberg has been confirmed as playing the Wolfman with the light-up eyes. In addition, she also played Duros number 3, who is visible over Greedo's shoulder during his close-ups, who, it is probably no coincidence, also wears the same exact jacket as Arlael Schaus, come to think of it. In addition to what's already been mentioned in Chapter 6, she was Trinto Duaba and one Cantina band member, Doik Nats. John Berg was of course a member of the team that Rick Baker put together to build these supplemental masks, and in addition to the aliens we have already looked at that he played, such as operating half of Hammerhead for example, he also wore masks for Dovington, and 1 Cantina band member. Another of Baker's team, we have already listed some of the aliens that he played, but we can add the following to the list. Yam Knows herself, My Yum Oneth, and also a Cantina band member. It's been decided in recent years that Tippett was Figrin Dan himself. Yet another member of the Baker Dream Team, in addition to the Bith at Muftak's table, Liren Karn, he was also one of the Cantina band members. Gibraltar Merrill was a part-time librarian on Star Wars, and she played one of the Cantina band members, Tech Moore. Let's summarize the Cantina band. Personally, I don't think we should be too dogmatic about who played which exact Cantina band member. I would lay you odds that most of them don't really remember, which becomes obvious when some of the signed photos begin to overlap. Gibraltar Merrill always signs as Tech Moore. Kim Falkenberg signs as Doik Nats. John Berg seems to always sign a picture of Nayland Cheel, even without labeling it, and it's been decided that Phil Tippett was Figrin Dan, and this is about as much as we can be sure of. Adding Penny McCarthy and Doug Beswick gives us 6 of the 7 members. In trying to determine the 7th member, though, sources can vary wildly. Some articles even say Rick Baker was present, but we know he wasn't by his own admission. Some articles list Rob Bottin, Baker's assistant, but unless something new comes to light, there are no photos showing he was even there. Who was present at Dovington's was fellow mask maker Lane Liska, who after all was inside the Muftak costume. John Berg even confirmed this at Star Wars Celebration 6, as Liska unfortunately had passed away in 1994. After years of bad information, this allows us to accurately list out all 7 band members, once and for all. Today, we investigate a strange phenomenon that happened during the very first year that A New Hope, hereafter referred to as Star Wars, existed. From the time that the movie was released until very nearly a full year later, the Cantina scene was completely omitted from marketing and merchandise of all kinds. Moviegoers raved about it. Kids on the playground talked endlessly about its bizarre and mysterious aliens, and yet, as the movie became the biggest thing in the world and the scene became ingrained in the public culture, we couldn't get photos of it anywhere to save our lives. Note that the Marvel comic does not fall into these parameters because issue 2 actually came out before the movie did. Several years ago, as I was first starting to organize this project, a short article appeared on the official site in July of 2009 entitled Cantina Cover-Up, Investigating a Mos Eisley Mystery, written by Pete Vilmer. It gave a few examples and one helpful quote that we will look at, but barely scratched the surface of the issue, and then quickly disappeared altogether. After years of finding more and more examples illustrating the problem, I felt that it was time for a more comprehensive, and as close to chronological as possible, study. Let's look at the many examples first, and then discuss a couple of reasons explaining why it was that the Cantina disappeared. From a set of 64 numbered stills issued by 20th Century Fox for publication and promotion of the film, only one had anything to do with the Cantina at all, and it was this one, K-42. And as you can see, no one else but the main characters are even visible, and the background is completely blurry. We will refer to this still as Han's Table, and you will be hearing about it again as we go along. A set of 16 lobby cards was also issued, as well as a large 20-page program book that could be purchased in some theaters. Both contained 0 Cantina content whatsoever. The soundtrack album opens to show photos from the film, but, you guessed it, no Cantina anywhere, other than the Cantina Band song, of course. The much-beloved Story of Star Wars album has no problem giving us a shortened audio version of the scene, but there isn't a single photo of it to be found in the accompanying book. The Star Wars novelization includes a section of color pages with photos from the film, amazingly none showing the Cantina. The very week Star Wars was released, Time declared it the year's best film in a feature story with several pictures, but no Cantina. As 1977 progressed, a steady stream of magazines and startup publications covered the movie. An official poster magazine was even created. These, of course, are not all of the publications that year by a long shot, but it's enough to give us an idea of what was going on. While one single magazine in this group contained a photo of Ben Kenobi holding a lightsaber in the cantina, with no aliens visible, of course, and several included the Han's table photo we mentioned earlier, the vast majority had absolutely nothing referring to the cantina whatsoever, while what we all wanted to see was photos of aliens. The Star Wars pop-up book would have been an excellent place for a Han and Greedo page, with a tab to pull to make Greedo's fried torso hit the table, or even a fold-out barroom scene. This would at least be corrected in a 1995 pop-up book, but we will get to that in the future. An interesting thing happened with the publication of The Star Wars Album, a reprint of an international collector's magazine for the United States. One of the items removed when this book was brought to America was this cool cantina painting by the amazingly talented Hildebrandt brothers. Now, why would this page be omitted? Things were beginning to get suspicious. If you were a lucky kid during the time of Star Wars, then you had a shoebox full of the top Star Wars trading cards, and you treasured them, poring over their images and factoids, and desperately hoping to be able to complete the puzzles on the card backs. Amazingly, for 4 of Top's 5 series, that's the first 264 cards, the only crumbs we got about the cantina were 3 cards. Card number 97, look, it's Han's table again. Almost. Card 135, and 162, and no aliens or cantina patrons of any kind to be seen anywhere. The same was true for that year's Wonder Bread trading card set, as well as the trading card set from Big G cereals, and the Big G sticker card set too. The phenomenal metal Star Wars lunchbox from 1977 would have been elevated to a new level with the cantina scene on one panel. The same is true for the Star Wars poster and Dip Dots painting sets that Kenner made. Everyone knows that Kenner's initial Star Wars output consisted of only paper items, but the first couple of series of jigsaw puzzles would have benefited greatly from a cantina scene. And what about the Star Wars school supplies? The dozens and dozens of greeting and birthday cards. Not one single cantina scene, or alien for that matter. Ken Films accomplished the impossible when they were able to release a reel of Star Wars scenes, with the longest version running 19 minutes in late 1977 while the film was still in theaters. And do you think it included one frame from the cantina? Nope. The first Star Wars calendar was issued late that year. How about 1 page in 12 months showing us the cantina? Negative. We could go on all day, but I think by this time you probably get the point that the cantina was purposefully excluded. So why was this? I think that there are 2 reasons. Number 1. If you've watched the series up to this point, you know that George Lucas was less than thrilled with the way that the scene turned out, especially when it came to the Elstree aliens, prompting him to add more with the extra shots filmed at Dovington's. When the film became a huge hit, he may have relaxed his opinion a little bit going forward, but it was the approved content, meaning the Dovington's aliens photos, that were put out for the public most every time. It's as if, apart from the sequence's necessary moments of Greedo and the fight with Walrus Man, he really wasn't all that sure about the rest of it. Secondly, and much more important from a legal perspective, is this. If you've watched this series up to this point, then you also know that Rick Baker brought 6 pre-made masks from home to bolster the ranks of the masks that he and his crew had turned out. He intended these to be background aliens, and was pretty surprised when, for a couple of them, this wasn't the case at all. At some point, someone realized this caused ownership issues, and therefore legal problems, by the time of the film's release, if not before. As proof, here are 3 examples that illustrate this. In the 2009 article mentioned at the beginning of this video, the author Pete Vilmer spoke with Charles Lippincott, who was Vice President of Marketing and Merchandising for the early years of Lucasfilm. Lippincott is a very important figure in Star Wars history who is sadly mostly unsung. He reinvented film marketing in a new way by taking it directly to the fans, and famously promoted Star Wars at comic conventions a year before the film even came out. It was Lippincott that encouraged Lucas to expand his new brand to comics, television, and beyond, heading up the first Star Wars fan club himself. He was one of the founding pillars of the Star Wars films, said Lucas when Lippincott died in 2020. He was the first person to both develop Star Wars licensing and engage with the fans. When Pete Vilmur asked Lippincott about the withholding of Cantina-related photos and items in early Star Wars marketing, Lippincott reinforced, carefully, that there were, quote, questions surrounding the merchandising of Baker's existing masks. Secondly, in the excellent 2015 book, Star Wars, the Original Topps Trading Card Series, Volume 1, author Gary Girani, a writer for Topps since their very first Star Wars card series, mentions how the Cantina's alien patrons were held back from licensees at first, and were kept under wraps. Any image from the Cantina was considered gold to Star Wars licensees, as Lucas and company kept the lid on photos from this scene for an excruciatingly long time. Thirdly, and the best example of all, is the Bill Selby Cantina poster, which was being created while all of these legal problems were going on. You have probably seen this iconic poster somewhere before. It was sold in magazines such as Famous Monsters, and even ended up being a cover for them later on. Interestingly, when getting the poster's artwork approved by Lucasfilm, Selby initially wanted to include some entirely different aliens, and was actually told to remove some of them and replace them with different ones. Luckily for us, the artist saved his original artwork, so we can play a quick game of spot the differences. Selby was forced to remove 4 aliens. First, Lak Sivrak got the axe, and was replaced with Zutmore. Well, the Force Ghost of Zutmore, from the holiday special, which shows you the time period we are talking about. Next, Trinto Duaba had to go, to be replaced with a Godel. Then, Bom Vimden, who was replaced with Mayo. And finally, Labria, who was double replaced with Him Dazon and Walrus Man. So, if you're following along at home, the removed aliens were Lak Sivrak, Trinto Duaba, Bom Vimden, and Labria. When asked why he was forced to alter his artwork, Selby said that it had something to do with a licensing snafu caused by Rick Baker supplying some of his own masks. After almost a full year of lockdown, the gates apparently opened in the spring of 1978. Looking at events in chronological order tells us an interesting story. For most of 1978, the Lucasfilm plan seemed to be to avoid Baker's extra characters entirely, but by 1979, this situation had completely reversed itself, as we will see momentarily. We may never know exactly how it all got worked out, only that it obviously did. Knowing that Lucasfilm, or especially George himself, does not prefer to be beholden to anyone, we can only assume that they bought the designs outright, rather than rent them going forward. After all, 4 of the 6 have even been made into action figures at this point, with a 5th announced as a HasLab potential. Lastly, let's look at the Cantina items that were finally released. It was hardly a flood of merchandise, and really more of a slow drip. Let's begin with 1978's Series 5 of the Topps trading cards. Cantina photos were such a big deal, and so desired by fans, that they were actually advertised on the box and the wrappers. And we were only talking about 8 cards out of 66 in that series. We have already seen all 8 of these images elsewhere, so here they are all together. Next, Topps produced Star Wars sugar-free gum, with collectible wrappers showing a Star Wars image inside. Out of 66 different wrappers to collect, only 2 pertain to the Cantina, and those were Brainiac, strange choice, and a Cantina band member. The Star Wars storybook was published in April of 1978 and burned up school book order forms across the country. There was a 2-page spread inside depicting the Cantina scene, with photos of safe aliens, most of them even matching the very Topps cards we already looked at, as well as one of Han and Greedo. The poster art series by Craftmaster was expanded to include this Keen Cantina poster, featuring only approved aliens, of course. Interestingly, the artist put large eyeballs on the Dice Ibagon alien. Well, he has to see, I guess. Cinefantastique magazine's spring 1978 issue had a large Making of Star Wars article, with a few pages covering Rick Baker's team, and no photos of the offending 6 aliens. There was a surprise final cartridge released for the Star Wars movie viewer called Danger at the Cantina, which condensed the entire scene into a 45-second or so loop that the user could crank forwards or backwards. It's difficult to estimate the exact release date for this cartridge, but if it helps, 3 of the offending Rick Baker aliens are seen. Everyone knows that Kenner's late 1978 second wave of Star Wars action figures finally included Cantina characters, and lo and behold, they are all safe choices. In retrospect, Snaggletooth really was a surprise. The Cantina Adventure playset was a Sears exclusive that of course gave us the infamous blue Snaggletooth figure. The Star Wars Poster Monthly magazine had its very first Cantina content in September of 1978 with issue 12, which featured the Duros on the cover, and inside Han and Greedo and the Cantina Band. It should be mentioned here that in November of 1978, no less than 5 of the problem aliens appeared in the Star Wars Holiday Special, including, for the first time, my buddy Rungs, who was built for another studio's movie anyway and originally rejected by Lucas, but here officially became a Star Wars alien. Series 4, the final series of Kenner jigsaw puzzles, arrived in 1979 and gave us a very difficult-to-do 500-piece Cantina Band puzzle. In January 1979, note the date, Star Wars Poster Monthly issue 16 published another Cantina page with, for the first time, Labria, as well as Greedo, Veltapern Travag's table, and Gorindon? Well, he was outside the Cantina anyway. Close enough. In March of 1979, Poster Monthly number 18, apparently now thrilled the legal issues were obviously over, gave us both Labria and Bomb Venden on the cover, which meant they were the featured poster too. How far they had come. And speaking of that, it would be another year or slightly more before fans would ever get to see the Cantina scene in their own homes, when Ken Films made up for their previous mistake and released a sequel to their Star Wars Super 8 reel, this time containing both the Cantina scene as well as an edited Death Star trench run. In closing, one thing that's bothered me all these years is this. If all of the legal issues with the masks were resolved by 1979, why then did George Lucas bother to replace the 2 Wolfmen for the special edition years later? After all, if he was displeased with the scene as a whole, why didn't he change more things, or anything else? In my opinion, knowing what we know, the answer is spite. There have been some famous examples of Lucas's grudges over the years, and I think the irritations connected with this issue stayed with him for a long time. It's just my personal opinion, but I think that when he finally had the ability to do so, he took the opportunity to wipe them out. Well, almost. Next time, a history of Cantina playsets, from the very beginning in 1978 until, right this very minute, something new has been added. All this and more in Chapter 8. Thanks for watching. The first Cantina playset was neither the Cantina nor a playset. The Cantina Adventure set was really just a cardboard backdrop with foot pegs that was supposed to represent the streets of Mos Eisley, and I guess the outside of the Cantina. Probably. Now, it did have some very unique and engaging artwork. As a small child, I would stare at it and wonder about the activity behind the doorway, but I wanted to see what was back there. The set was a Sears catalog exclusive. As much as we associate Star Wars with store exclusives, it's interesting to think that it was going on even in late 1978. It also included 4 action figures: Greedo, Walrus Man, Hammerhead, and the infamous Blue Snaggletooth. Unfortunately, the flimsy nature of the playset meant that it didn't survive most people's childhoods. In 1979, well after all of the legal troubles associated with the Cantina were addressed, see our previous Chapter 7 video, Kenner tried again with a much more successful Creature Cantina playset. Although far from movie accurate, it fit right into the style of the entire Kenner Star Wars line, and was much more play-oriented than its predecessor, with clever action features including rubber band-powered opening doors and sliding levers to move the action figures, even to simulate Greedo's, or somebody's, death. Another nice touch was the tiny fine print on the sticker for the doorway that actually says, "No droids." In addition to this, the playset included a colorful backdrop, again with intriguing artwork that you can get lost in. Sure, they took some liberties, but knowing the sparse source material that Lucasfilm shared with them, they probably had to. Here is a brief evolution of this classic playset. The Kenner concept art had the basic idea down for the playset from the beginning, with the doorway on the left, but the bar was to the far right. Notice the Death Star wall pattern, and also that the bar has a drink dispenser. This was a good basic idea, but the backdrop made the cantina look empty, and it desperately needed some play features. A prototype was constructed and could be seen in one of the early Kenner pack-in catalogs under the name Star Wars Cantina Cafe, which sounds ridiculous. Note that the playset design has been flipped, with the doorway now on the right and the bar on the left, complete with a drink dispenser in blue. The Death Star wall deco is still there. The quality of the photo isn't good enough for us to see clearly, but the backdrop now shows some signs of life, and some areas have been added for action figures to stand. A prototype was taken to Toy Fair that year, but slightly different than the one we just saw. The backdrop has been changed again, and it's hard to see, but looks like the drink dispenser has been removed. You've probably seen this photo somewhere, and it contains a lot to look at, including a rocket-firing Boba Fett with 1T, and a prototype action figure set of Chewbacca's family from the holiday special. Here is the spec sheet as shown in Kenner binders, where the playset has been improved even further. The doorway has been moved back to the left side, and a cantina table has now been added, as well as the famous levers to enable the action figures to move. The biggest difference to the finished product is the floor, which is one large label, which of course was wisely deleted. In the UK, a company called Palitoy had the license to issue Kenner's Star Wars toys, and they were allowed quite a bit of leeway in doing so. For the cantina, they retained the backdrop artwork and the color of the base, but that was about it. For comparison, here are the parts of the US version of the playset, and here is the Palitoy one, which was completely different in almost every other way. The bar even had a sticker featuring
bar stools.
This may be the earliest example of this fallacy. We will see it again later on. But that wasn't the end for the Creature Cantina. A few years later, Kenner repurposed the design for their failed Real West line, christening it the Real West Western Cafe, and finally getting the word cafe in there. While not exactly a playset, the next company to produce a cantina was Ertl in one of their AMT model kits. Their cantina action scene had a floor plan that was based on the one published in the Star Wars Technical Journal, which we saw in Chapter 3. Some liberties had to be taken though, like creating a stage for the band, complete with steps. 21 figurines were included with the model, including both Tonica sisters for the first time anywhere, which probably wasn't even legal at the time, and all you needed to paint them with was your favorite microscope. There was a band of 5 members and also a bartender whose name here was Woober? Could be a typo, but since he was already posed like he was dancing in the holiday special, the whole thing was pretty funny. Galoob's micro machines began with everyday cars and airplanes reduced to tiny size, and were advertised in a famous series of fast-talking commercials that made kids want them. By the mid-1990s, after Star Wars had been added to their fold, a series of transforming playsets was created, where the head and shoulders of a Star Wars character would unfold to reveal a complicatedly engineered playset. The C-3PO/Cantina playset was one of the best examples, with the shiny droid opening to reveal a compact cantina bar room on one side and Docking Bay 94 on the other. While not exactly movie accurate, its design was ingenious and may be the only time a toy manufacturer has portrayed the famous Mos Eisley docking bay, so points for that. Included were figures of Han, Greedo, 2 sandtroopers on one base labeled Stormtroopers, and 3 aliens only referred to by their species, Chadrafan, Duros, and Godel. There were much smaller transforming heads too, pocket-sized versions that included a figure of the featured character, and opened to show a small section of their environment. The Cantina-related mini playsets from this line were Greedo, although the background is a little suspect. I think that's a person at a table, but it could be a waitress carrying a tray. Figrin Dan, whose background makes perfect sense, and a Duros, technically Elor's Medak, whose background is a bar and bartender. Galoob also made a very slightly larger scale called Action Fleet. These figures usually had 3 points of articulation, unlike their Micro Machine cousins, and could actually sit down, which was very useful for vehicles. There were lots of great playsets for this scale too, but they never quite got around to making a Cantina, although there were several Cantina figures made. These were sold in the line's Battle Packs, a carded series of awesomeness that included a handful of figures and sometimes a small vehicle or creature. All in all, there were 14 specific Cantina-themed Action Fleet figures and 3 ancillary ones, making a total of 17 figures, which were available in 6 different Battle Packs. Battle Pack number 3 included a Walrus Man. Wait a second. That's better. He was only available in later versions for some reason, and an awesome Bantha as well. Battle Pack number 4 included Greedo. Battle Pack number 10 included Dr. Evazan, Gurinden, and a Jawa, which of course doesn't have to be a Cantina Jawa, just a Jawa. Battle Pack number 11 gave us Muftak and Figrin Dan. Battle Pack number 12 was completely Cantina themed, titled Cantina Smugglers and Spies, and included Hammerhead, or Momon Nadon, Laxivrak, Arcona, Duros, the Bartender, Labria, Nabrin Leeds, and the Typo of Advazek. And finally, Battle Pack number 17 was an Imperial Troops set, which gave you a Sand Trooper that you could use. By 1997, Star Wars had returned to movie theaters everywhere as the Special Editions. With a marketing explosion so big, it sent merchandise flying in all directions. Kenner, now going by their parent name of Hasbro, added 3 packs to their Power of the Force action figure line called Cinema Scenes. These were complete dioramas in themselves, which could be opened or displayed in their packaging. 2 3-packs in this line focused on the Cantina. The first, Cantina Showdown, was a Walmart exclusive and only included 1 new figure, the first Dr. Evazan action figure, who didn't even look that good, and retooled versions of Obi-Wan and Ponda Baba. All of this didn't even matter because the display base and the backdrop made the set so desirable and so unique, it was quickly driven up on the secondary market. Here is a better look at the backdrop without all of those figures in the way. The following year, 1998, brought us Cantina Aliens, which included Labria, Nabrin Leeds, and Takil, and not in such dynamic poses this time, making them more useful to collectors. Here is a better look at the backdrop of this 3-pack, which for some reason puts the droid detector in a booth, rather than at the Cantina entrance. At last, Hasbro was finally starting to make some aliens, but it began to dawn on fans, where was the Cantina? The answer came later that year, but not in a way that anyone expected. The Cantina at Mos Eisley was a 3D diorama that was first offered through the fan club as an exclusive and then, unusually, sold in retail stores as well. Named the Pop-Up Cantina by fans, it featured a cleverly engineered design that started out completely flat and opened up to reveal a 2-foot-wide playset. It sold so well, a 3D Jabba's throne room soon followed. But was it good? Well, it wasn't very accurate. Unfortunately, the thin cardstock couldn't hold up to multiple assembling and reassembling, or especially rigorous play. It also tended to warp and never displayed completely straight. Also, Hasbro, known for their confusing mistakes, made some confusing mistakes. The most glaring one was this, besides looking more like a Mexican restaurant than the movie Cantina. The inclusion of a pack-in exclusive action figure meant that completists would not skip this playset, and instead of the logical choice of a desperately needed bartender figure, we got a repaint of a recent Sand Trooper figure. Also, a few inexpensive accessories such as movable sculpted seats and tables, as well as glasses or cups would have gone a long way. Despite all of this, for several years afterward, it was a common sight to see many a photo of this playset on forums and websites, dusty and crammed full of people's Cantina action figures, trying to make it work. In short, it was all we had. In 2002, another series of Cantina figures with a partial environment was announced, which would be Walmart exclusives. The good news was, they would include sculpted sections of the Cantina bar, and even some drinking glasses. The bad news, though, quickly overwhelmed the good. The figures were all repacks, or slightly retooled versions, of Greedo, Hammerhead, and Walrus Man. Even though a bartender figure had been made the year before, the backdrop painting still included him, making it ridiculous to try and put, that figure behind the actual bar. Worst of all were the bar segments themselves. They were all straight with no curved ends and actually included, wait for it, bar stools. Yes, friends, Hasbro, for a series of action figures that, overwhelmingly up to that point, did not even have bendable knees, put bar stools in the cantina, which didn't even belong there to begin with. As a side note, Hasbro did issue the two curved ends of the bar years later, but fans didn't know how we were supposed to use them. Some actually cut the bar out of their pop-up cantinas, but because of the bar stools, just made a bad thing even worse. This series of figures failed so hard, Walmart refused any future ones, which were canceled. This was unfortunate because the second wave would have included some new and improved figures. Hasbro repurposed these into some Kmart 3-packs instead. Let's move away from Hasbro for a moment and instead go to the world's largest toy company, LEGO. As you probably know, LEGO acquired the Star Wars license in 1999, and hundreds of sets have followed since then. Their first attempt at a cantina came in 2004 with set 4501 Mos Eisley Cantina. Released shortly before minifigures were converted to flesh tones, this 193-piece set was much smaller than it needed to be, and included a remake of Luke's Landspeeder, a dewback, the booth and table where Greedo confronts Han, and 5 minifigures. As paltry as it was, it would be another 10 full years before LEGO would return to the cantina. In August of 2014 came set 75052, also called Mos Eisley Cantina. At 616 pieces, it included 8 minifigures, including new ones like the Bith Musician ×3. However, the piece count was hampered by a new dewback and yet another Landspeeder, which were unnecessary. In the end, this cantina was half the size it should have been. But the best thing about LEGO is if you don't like it, you can always rebuild it, which is exactly what many fans did, including this author, who doubled it with the second set and even customized a few missing aliens. In 2018, hopes were dashed yet again when set 75205 was released at 376 pieces. With an entryway, 1 booth, and again half a bar, the set was a disappointment. But not entirely, as after 3 tries, LEGO finally gave us a bartender figure, as well as a nice-looking Ubrikian speeder to park outside the door. It seemed like the collector had to combine and duplicate elements from each of LEGO's attempts in order to make a passable, somewhat complete cantina. Until 2020 will be remembered as a banner year of suck, but that fall, set 75290 was unveiled. At 3,187 pieces and 21 minifigures, this Master Builder set provided the full-sized cantina that fans have been waiting for. 6 alcoves provide plenty of seating, and outside, additional buildings, 2 evaporators, and a new speeder help flesh out the Mos Eisley streets. The set was a huge home run for LEGO, but not without some oversights. First, 2 important parts of the barroom were completely forgotten. The iconic red and blue stripes that run around the entire inside of the cantina, which were present in all of the earlier attempts, and the canopy above the bar, which the drink dispenser framework should connect to. Also, LEGO can't seem to nail down which alcove should be Han Solo's, and they have him on the wrong side. Still though, this set was a winner for me. If LEGO would only find a way to give us a couple more battle packs worth of aliens to help populate it, I'd come and mow their lawn for a year. Returning to Hasbro, the Galactic Heroes line began as a repurposing of an earlier Playskool series that aimed at the demographic of the very young Star Wars fan. Converting Star Wars characters to squatty, chunky, and even cute versions of themselves, the line expanded between the years of 2004 to 2010 to include vehicles large and small, creatures, and boxed dioramas complete with cardboard environments. These large diorama-like multi-packs, also named cinema scenes, were often store exclusives, and in 2007, Walmart carried 2 semicircular dioramas, Cantina Band and Cantina Encounter, that connected together to form the barroom. There were 19 figures between the 2 playsets, with the Band playset even featuring built-in electronics beneath the cardboard stage, enabling the modal nodes to play their famous song. Hasbro's Black Series, the 6-inch action figure line which began in 2013, is actually very behind when it comes to Cantina characters. Besides the main characters, Jawa and Sand Troopers, we've only gotten Greedo, Dr. Evazan, Ponda Baba, and the Cantina Band, with Hammerhead on the way. As for environments, you could get cardboard chairs and a table in the Cantina Showdown Rehash Multi-Pack, which was a Toys R Us exclusive. 2021 gave us a new Cantina Showdown, which was a Hasbro PulseCon exclusive, based on the 1997 Power of the Force 3-pack we looked at earlier. This box set included a Cantina bar and drink dispenser. Well, half of each, as it turns out. Yes, Hasbro actually expected fans to purchase 2 sets apiece, when the limit was 1, in order to have enough segments to make the entire bar and scaled down drink dispenser in the middle. It didn't help that many of their publicity photos they published utilized more parts than actually came with the set. You had to read the fine print. It remains to be seen whether these parts will ever be reissued, maybe even as a complete bar. Either way, we will need many more aliens to populate it. But it's not all bad news. Lots of collectors tend to be very critical of Hasbro, and as you can tell, I don't hold back either. But when they do something right, and especially give the fans what they want in the process, we should give them credit. Lastly, we finished with the newest Cantina playset of all, which should turn out to be the most accurate and the most complete ever. You'd have to be under a rock lately to not know that the crowd-funded HasLab Mos Eisley Cantina has been successfully backed, and even surpassed its minimum goal to unlock the next 2 tiers of funding, meaning that purchasers will receive even more action figures. As a footnote to chapters 5 and 6, we can now add vintage collection figures in 2025 for the Bartender, the Tonica Sisters for the first time ever, another Greedo, as well as a new super articulated Neighborn Leeds. Unfortunately, it will be close to 1.5 years before anyone has the actual playset to show off, so for now all we have are the Hasbro CGI renders. But they are exciting. An unfortunate side effect to this playset succeeding is prices for action figures of Cantina aliens have been skyrocketing. In a way, it's understandable though. The Power of the Force 2 line turns 30 next year, hard to believe, and modern Star Wars figures are now older than some of the people collecting them. Not everyone has been able to follow Hasbro's output religiously, which is what it will take to populate this amazing Cantina. There are many characters they have only made once, and some even that the collector will need multiples of. Fans are left hoping that Hasbro finds a way to address this. It's going to be interesting to see the first videos that are posted when this playset finally arrives, and to see how collectors display and populate their cantinas. One of the first things we will have to do is figure out a good way to make a floor. I wish Hasbro had given us some sort of mat, but I'm sure collectors will come up with something that will work. Let me know in the comments what you plan to do. Next time, hide your kids, hide your wives. It's the divider of fans and the bane of George Lucas's existence. The infamous, the dreaded, the Star Wars Holiday Special. Don't miss this one, but remember, you have been warned. On November 17, 1978, a 2-hour special aired on CBS that was watched by millions. It was based on the most successful film of all time, and even included its original cast. Other celebrity entertainers also appeared as special guests, including TV, movie, and even rock stars. Yet, this special aired only once, and has never been repeated in the decades that followed. What's more, the program has never been officially released. No Super 8, no Betamax, no VHS, no CED, no Laserdisc, no DVD, no Blu-ray, no streaming, you get the point. In fact, the man whose name is on it would prefer it to stay buried deep beneath the sands of time. Of course, this infamous program is the Star Wars Holiday Special, and that description does not even begin to accurately describe it. What it was a bizarre yet thoroughly 1970s mishmash of skits and songs consisting of studio-filmed videotape segments, film clips, musical numbers, a cross-dressing Harvey Korman, and even an animated sequence. The special confused even its most sober viewers on the night that it aired. When the credits rolled, most people were left asking what they had just watched and what these frizzies were. Over the years, I've come to realize there are two kinds of people in the world. Those who know that the holiday special is awful, and those who know it's awful and enjoy it because of this. Both groups know what the best part is. Ironically, for all of its infamy, its genesis was quite impressive. Suggested by CBS, plotted initially by Lucas, with design work by Joe Johnston and Ralph McQuarrie, and costumes by legends like Stan Winston, Bob Mackie, and Rick Baker, it would seem there was no way that the project could fail. Unfortunately, this endeavor, flush with writers and multiple producers, had schizophrenia from the start. The original director resigned after a troubled first 3 days, and with Lucas busy on other projects, the special slowly morphed into something else entirely. In fairness, it should be pointed out that, while Lucas has made his share of mistakes, this special really doesn't deserve, completely, to be on that list. The idea of a TV special was a timely idea, and it would have kept Star Wars in the public's minds while the sequel was being prepared. Concept art from the artists mentioned above was promising. Lucas brought the initial story he wanted to tell about Chewbacca coming home for Life Day, and he wasn't as interested in what would fill the spaces in the special, which got longer as production moved forward. Unfortunately, singing and dancing, comedy/variety shows were all the rage during this time period. It was a recipe for trouble. Fans have never been sure of how involved Lucas actually was, as over the years he has downplayed his involvement with the show greatly. The truth is, the writers were able to spend a full 12-hour day with him right off the bat, asking questions about Wookiee life and lore, but afterwards, his involvement was limited to visits here and there when he could spare it. One of his contributions was a helmet that would allow Wookiees to watch different scenes in their minds, which he thought might serve as a device to allow the show to change segments. So, can we blame George for Wookiee pornography? Well, indirectly. Leonard Rips, one of the writers, said it best. I think he wanted to make a sweet and sentimental vision of a holiday season, and I think it evolved into something maudlin, which was not what I thought his vision was. Either way, it was a lesson to Lucas about what happens when you do not have complete creative control, and he would remember this going forward. While all of this is a long and convoluted story, only one segment concerns us here for our purposes, the return to the Mos Eisley Cantina. Whether this cantina is our cantina, though, is open to debate. Using many of the original masks from the film, along with a few new ones created by Ellis Berman and assisted by Rick Baker, the segment attempts to recreate one of the film's most popular scenes, which by this time was finally beginning to get its due. This appearance of the cantina would not exactly be a dimly lit, shadowy den of menace. Because of the use of videotape and studio lights, it would instead look like the set of a 1970s sitcom or an electric company skit, with the lights a little lower. What's more, the star of Maude was hired to play the bartender. Clearly, the producers felt this was a recipe for comedy gold. The entire scene took nearly 24 straight hours to film, commencing August 23, 1978, and soon after it had wrapped, the director, David Akamba, quit and had to be replaced. Mask-related problems, similar to those when first filming the Cantina Band, were much more widespread this time because of the long and gruelingly hot shoot. In fact, actors were dropping like flies and actually had to be given oxygen by an EMT. One of the writers, Pat Proft, brought his young son, who was a fan of the film, to watch the scene being shot. Some of them were passing out because they didn't have oxygen, and there's my son watching these creatures he loves die in front of him. The real plot, if it can be called that, of the holiday special concerns Chewbacca and his family, and the cantina seemed like a far jump from scenes on Kashyyyk, or as Art Carney says, Kazook. So the writers of the show came up with an idea, although it made little sense. While Imperial troops are searching Chewbacca's treehouse, the large viewing screen in the living room activates, informing all Imperial personnel that the following film is required viewing. Apparently, the Empire likes to screw around with their employees and require them to watch surprise videos from time to time, which must have been extremely inconvenient when you were in the middle of a gunfight or raping and pillaging. The other side of this is, if you found yourself besieged by Imperial troops and one of these pop-up videos began, it would be an excellent time to escape. What makes even less sense is that the video is entitled Life on Tatooine and begins with some Star Wars film clips, including the unused scene of the Flash Gordon midget, Rykar Ridgerd, running into an alley and encountering a giant pair of bird-like legs. Then suddenly the scene changes to a supposedly live feed inside the cantina. Whether customers know that they are being filmed and broadcast to the farthest edge of the galaxy is anyone's guess. What the purpose is of broadcasting this to the farthest edge of the galaxy, and what makes it, quote, required viewing, are also anyone's guess. The bartender we are familiar with is not around. This new one is named Ackmena. She goes around like a hostess, pouring drinks and mingling with the bizarre array of alien customers. Eventually, a guy called Krellman comes in, played by Harvey Korman, who obviously lost a bet with his agent because he plays 3 roles in the holiday special. Krellman is a weird humanoid alien who has a crater on the top of his head. He can actually pour drinks into it, because apparently they get to his brain faster that way. Right about this time, a message comes on the view screen, which makes this a video within a video. Are you following this? This meta message says that Tatooine is being put under a curfew by the Empire, and everyone has to go home. How the Empire is going to enforce this, we have no idea. The mood of the cantina becomes dour and unruly. Ackmena asks all her customers to go home, but they refuse. Suddenly, she has an idea and begins singing and dancing. Now they all head for the hills, except Harvey Krellman. The wretched song she sings was written by TV veterans Ken and Mitzi Welch, and is entitled Good Night But Not Goodbye. You can look up the lyrics online, but they are so bad, Figrin Dan was going by the alias of Barbarine at that time. It goes on for about 17 minutes and actually includes a conga line of aliens exiting the bar. Upon showing B. Arthur the song for the first time, said Ken Welch, we played the song and she just cried. When we watch the finished product, friends, it's our turn. Several original masks from the movie were used for the scene. Writer Bruce Valanche said that they were supposed to go to the Lucasfilm warehouse and select remainder aliens, but clearly more were required for the scene. We will divide this crowd into 2 groups. Costumes that were in the original Star Wars cantina, although they are not always the same character, and costumes created specifically for the holiday special. After being ignored for decades, this group shot appeared in Star Wars Insider number 144 in 2013 and finally assigned names to some of the unknowns. Arliel Schaus. Rick Baker's 1974 mask with the light-up eyes was reused here, but this time with completely different clothes. At least in Star Wars, some alien species own different outfits. The modal nodes. It has finally been established that this band was that band, although we all knew it. An article on the official website said the smaller version of the band is made up of the following, and points out that some of the instruments shown are different than what we see in the film. No kidding. Bloodlow, aka Ludlow, the brother of Greedo. If you keep a sharp eye out, you will see that photos of this character are sometimes used to represent Greedo himself. The Star Wars Holiday Special website points out that, being one of the named aliens in the show, the script indeed spells his name out as Bloodlow. Wikipedia tells an interesting story. In 1978, a publicity campaign launched by Lucasfilm used actors dressed as the new character Boba Fett, who put up actual wanted posters in department stores, as shown here, where Greedo's brother is called Ludlow. Deneb Both, formerly Amerha. This character was going to be given the unused name from the 1978 Lucasfilm memo of Amerha. In 2001, Decipher published a game card and named the character Deneb Both, and that name has become accepted. In the TV special, the same hammerhead puppet and arms were used with a brand new robe. Side. This alien is said to be a different Abyssin than Mayo, and hair was obviously added to the mask since the film was completed. Compare it here to the original mask. The eye could now sort of open and close, but is mostly closed for the time that we see him, when he is thrown out of the cantina after pulling a knife on the Wolfman, Arliel Schaus. Hem Dazon. This is said to be the exact same Arcona that we see in the film, and he is also presented in a similar way, meaning we only briefly see his head dancing through the frame. Apparently an extra was wearing the mask on his or her head. The Duros. These are supposed to be the same pair of aliens as in the original film, but as we discussed in Chapter 6, there had been a concerted effort to change their names, again, for no good reason. They wear different clothes than in the film, and now both of them finally have alien hands, meaning one Duros has experienced a biological change since we last saw them. Drayton. Another unique Godel. This one also wears different clothes than the others we have seen, and looks more brown in tone than the Godel mask used for the film, so perhaps it was altered. An article on the official site once suggested that there was an often missed second Godel in the scene, but there is never more than one at any given time on screen. Trinto Duaba. This too is the same alien from the original Cantina scene. He is once again in the background and comes into the cantina with Labria. His brown cloak is different, but not too far from what he wore in the film. Labria. And speaking of Labria, he comes into the cantina after the Empire's curfew and actually pulls a gun on B. Arthur, so that's something, I guess. The problem with this alien is, there's just not a good way to use this mask, other than a brief cutaway shot, because no matter what you do, it's grinning all the time. Pons Limbic. Here's another original Cantina customer that is not only the same character, but also wearing the exact same clothes as the last time we saw him. The beauty of this is, if you have the action figure, he is ready for your holiday special Cantina diorama. If the institution you reside in allows you to use sharp things to actually make a holiday special diorama. Caldera Rigum, formerly Quatrain. We don't get a very good look at him, but this is the Muftak costume with the giant tan vest added, and probably pants? This is the second holiday special character we have seen so far that Decipher incorporated into their Star Wars customizable card game. They also named the alien, which is an anagram of the name of a Decipher employee, Michael Gerard. Bom Vimden. This is also the same alien we see in the original Cantina, but he is now wearing a leather vest that originated from Planet of the Apes. Interestingly, there also appears to be a second Advisay alien in this scene, which we will cover in a moment. Salamahal. As we talked about in Chapter 5, this is a separate alien and was not present in the original Cantina. You will note that this photo was taken between rounds of filming because the actor has no gloves and is also holding a straw, which was inserted into the mask to help the actor breathe during breaks. Yamnos. Here is another case where an original mask was used but ended up being a different character. The clothes are also completely different from the film. This alien can only briefly be seen in the show, but he is sitting in one of the two alcoves with the Ket Malice alien. Teek Sidbam. It's not Walrus Man, but he does wear the same orange jacket, in a short sleeve version with the frayed shirt underneath. He also has the flipper hands that are correct to the species. He looks deep in thought here, but actually does quite a bit of dancing around in the show, where he was played by Rick Wagner. Akmina. And then there was the other bartender. While this bartender is much more chummy with her clientele, she is still not above some tough love when it is required. She carries no weapons because, after all, she has her singing voice. Also, no matter what time it is or what is going on, she is continuously making that face. Cameraman Larry Hyder said that Arthur was, quote, cold and demanding on set. She was pretty much Maud. Socio Kakra. Until the Star Wars Insider feature, this small, white-faced humanoid did not have a name. She utters no sound in the special, but it is clear that she is a helper to Akmina and goes around polishing the bar and bringing her things. Kelbo. It was conveniently decided, after the fact, that this alien is a Southern Nikto because of his passing resemblance to the Return of the Jedi aliens, which of course were not even created when the special first aired. Krellman. This amounts to 1/3 of Harvey Korman's contribution to the Star Wars Holiday Special. Named the biggest loser of the Holiday Special by this author, Korman was hilarious on the Carol Burnett Show and in Mel Brooks movies, but he just doesn't have any material to work with here. Maybe Tim Conway as another alien would have helped. His lovesick pandering to Akmina, even grabbing her at one point, is unnerving, and after all, she needs him like a hole in the head. See what I did there? Ket Malice. This is a weird one, because a great portion of the costume budget obviously went into this new alien's design. He even has lobster claws, but you can't even see him clearly in the actual show. When Decipher made their Star Wars card game, they called him a Deshade, and sneakily photoshopped him into the original Cantina, fooling a lot of people at the time. Call Nern. This is another tricky one. This author does not agree that there are 2 Godels in the holiday special Cantina, but apparently there are 2 Advocate aliens. This second one sits in an alcove with Rungs, the giant mouse. Bomvimden sits at a table in the middle of the room. There is one very brief wide shot of the barroom floor where you can just barely see the 2 of them at the same time. Probably. It looks like you can see the front of Nern's head leaning forward, but even the best copies of the holiday special have 1978 videotape levels of clarity. Nern wears the studded vest that Bomvimden wore in the film, and it appears that his eyes are redder. This could have been done to differentiate the 2. Feasibly, if Baker or Lucasfilm had retained the original mold, it wouldn't be that difficult to produce another copy of the mask for the show. It would help if we had a really good group shot that showed the 2 of them together, or if we only knew where the masks were now. Mir Rowe, formerly Lion Man. This one is so lame, I would be willing to bet my complete set of vintage Star Wars figures that Rick Baker had nothing to do with it. Or Baboon Man, who's coming up later for that matter. Of course, this is just filler for the room, and we all know that, but still, come on. Graven Reub. Or, more appropriately, Nightmare Fuel. You can actually see this terrifying thing at a couple of brief points in the segment. It has been decided that it is an E-Bith, a mutated strain of Bith, and like a lot of fiction, this has roots in the truth. An article on the official site mentioned that Rick Baker made several variations from the original Cantina band member mold, and that our horrifying friend here was actually one of those. What's more, a photo from Famous Monsters number 159 from 1979 showed the mask, along with the Muftak suit and the Brainiac mask in the home studio of Rick Baker. Let's hope we never see it again. Rungs, Tintin Dwarf. We have talked about him at various points so far, but this guy finally gets his big scene and his chance to become official. In fact, a few years later in 1981, when the Star Wars radio drama was produced, Luke specifically names a Tintin Dwarf as being present in the cantina. During Akmina's terrible song, she even cuddles up to the creature, sits in his booth, and gives him a loving side hug. Thorpe. This is said to be a copy of the Jaspera mask we looked at in Chapter 6, just flesh-colored instead of painted black. And that's certainly what it appears to be, which is extremely lazy. I mean, an expedient use of resources to maximize budgetary limitations. Torque. I suppose the cantina gets extra rowdy at night because not only does Akmina get an assistant, she gets a bouncer too. I guess you could say he was necessary to the story, but we are really in Croft Super Show territory here. Saban Vikan, formerly Baboon Man. How would you like to get a very exciting call from your agent telling you that you have a role in an upcoming Star Wars TV special, and then the very next sentence is, you have to be something called Baboon Man? Poor guy, you can even see it on his face. And speaking of his face, his crew nickname makes absolutely no sense. Since when are baboons olive green? Zutmore, later Zutton. As we have said, one of the original Snaggletooth masks was rebuilt into this one. If you compare the 2 designs, you can see that many changes were made. The eyes are different, the mouth is open, the ears are no longer large and sticking out, and of course, the hair is totally new as well. We've already discussed how Zutmore's photo was used by Kenner when they made the red Snaggletooth figure, making it unclear exactly who the figure was supposed to be. In 2001, this friendly-looking guy was a natural choice for Hasbro to make into the first official action figure from the Star Wars Holiday Special. Unfortunately, they used the name Zutton, which Decipher had invented for their card game to refer to one of the 2 Cantina Snivians. Zutmore is the actual name that is spelled out in the Holiday Special script. So it's all kind of a mess. Personally, I've had a love-hate relationship with the Holiday Special. Ever since, as a tiny child, I became upset when the Imperials ripped the head off of Lumpy Stuffed Bantha, and I missed the whole middle of the show. I love the uninhibited 70s-ness of it all, and I can recommend watching it with the Riff Tracks commentary. But let's be honest, it did some damage. Also, somehow I got through this entire video without resorting to any Golden Girls jokes whatsoever, so you're welcome. In a bizarre twist that only the 2020s can provide, you can actually watch the animated segment, The Faithful Wookiee, in excellent quality on the Plus streaming platform. And this brings up a good point. Writer Bruce Valanche remembers George Lucas telling the holiday special production team that he had, quote, 10 stories written. There were to be 6 movies. Note, no matter what he said, these movies were not written yet, leaving 4 other stories that he wanted to produce in a different way, one of them being Boba Fett's debut. So, knowing what we know, that gives us 1 through 6, the complete Star Wars saga, 7, Splinter of the Mind's Eye, 8, Chewbacca returning home for Life Day, 9, the story of the faithful Wookiee, and my parting thought for you is, what in the world was the 10th story? Sure, it could be normal Lucas hyperbole. After all, at one point there were going to be 9 or even 12 movies, but if anyone has any idea, I would love to hear it. Otherwise,
The world may never know.
next time, we begin an in-depth look at vintage appearances of the Mos Eisley Cantina in other media, such as comics, television, and much more. Among the sights you will see in this chapter are a hut with 1 tea, a Bith in a bed sheet, and Muftak completely drunk. Wait, what? As we have seen in our previous chapters, the Cantina scene made a lasting impact on fans, and even though it wasn't officially given any coverage in the early days of Star Wars, see Chapter 7, it quickly cemented itself firmly into pop culture. Today, we will take a look at the various other places it appeared in those early days, outside of movie theaters, beginning with comics. Without a doubt, one of the most important early Star Wars products was the Marvel Comics adaptation, which launched a title that continued to 107 issues. In a strategic move, the comic began a few months before the film debuted in theaters, allowing the story to be half completed by the time the film was released and building interest among its excited readers. Written by Roy Thomas and drawn by Howard Chaykin, with additional art by Steve Lee Aloha, the risky adaptation was a great success and lived on in reprintings, including giant-sized treasuries, which this author read until they were in tatters. The Cantina scene appears in issue 2, entitled 6 Against the Galaxy, and even though Marvel was very limited in the reference material they received, the scene is still represented very well. Let's jump in. Once Ben warns Luke about the Cantina, Luke is suddenly in trouble in the very next panel. Note that Nagola Dewagi Wooldugger Note that what the alien says is verbatim from the actual script, and so is the "Don't insult us" line. Wait, who said that? Did you notice that Luke has 3 attackers, as in the finished, revised 4th draft script, one of them being a small rodent? And Marvel also seems to share the notion that our little friend Cabe fits that description perfectly. In 2013, when Dark Horse adapted the rough draft screenplay into a comic called The Star Wars, they too used Cabe as one of the attackers, who runs away after the fight. It's lucky for us that the fight didn't turn out this way in the actual film, otherwise we wouldn't have the Cabe we know and love, who is a girl. The next panel tells us that Ben has cut 2 of the aggressors to pieces. Oh, and there is a hand on the floor. Directly after the fight, the comic skips Boshek entirely and has Obi-Wan introduce Luke to Chewbacca. Is it just me, or does he look very much like David Hasselhoff here? I have always thought that. The remainder of the scene is very well done, especially Greedo, and is also interesting for the background aliens, who are sometimes creatively depicted, sometimes invented. It's also famous for its depiction of Jabba the Hutt with 1 T, which goes back to the lack of reference materials mentioned earlier, and of course proves above all else that Lucas did not have all of the movies written ahead of time, or know what Jabba even looked like at the time of the first film, or for years afterward, as Marvel was allowed to use this Jabba twice more, even as far as 1980. But since this isn't the Jabba Compendium, we should probably move on. We need to leave Marvel momentarily and look at a fanzine called Rockets Blast Comic Collector, who in issue 139, published in October 1977, printed a scathing full-page article by James Van Hise entitled Star Wars Marvel Style, Where It Went Wrong. Although less critical of Roy Thomas's writing, Van Hise complained that Chaykin's artwork was disappointing, especially concerning Obi-Wan's fight in the cantina. Why then, when he drew it, did he pick, virtually without exception, all the most uninteresting angles to portray it in a composition which made the scene come across as incidental, instead of as one of the most talked about sequences in the film? Van Hise also said he was so frustrated that he asked artist Kerry Gamble to redraw the 2 pages we just looked at to show how interesting it should have been, basing his portrayal on both the novel as well as the finished film. This resulted in a much more violent sequence, which, in all honesty, probably would never have seen the light of day in a mainstream comic book at that time, but is still amazing on its own, and a rare Star Wars comic that lots of collectors don't know about. The first thing we notice is that the artist definitely had the advantage of repeated viewings of the film, which resulted in more accurate aliens. Then we come to the second page, where Obi-Wan hacks up 3 aggressors, and leaves a huge mess for somebody to clean up. Interestingly, before the fanzine went to print, they sent both the Van Hise article and Gamble's artwork to Roy Thomas at Marvel, giving Thomas enough time to write a response, which they included in the actual issue. Thomas, of course, defends Marvel's adaptation, saying they had little to no reference materials to work with, going on to say that he left the Star Wars comic entirely after issue 7 because he felt vaguely abused by Star Wars Corporation, which wanted me to somehow read George Lucas's mind from afar and come up with precisely what he would do or want done in a given situation, when in point of fact, it took him 6 years, several totally different plots, and various collaborators to achieve the movie you saw on the screen. Unfortunately, that 7th issue was the first new material after the conclusion of the movie's adaptation, where Thomas created Jackson, the 6-foot-tall rabbit who talked like Bugs Bunny. For our purposes here, the cantina scene had a connection to this, too. In Marvel's fan club magazine Foom, number 21, the cover of which gives us another Marvel depiction of the cantina scene. He says, "One of the characters in the bar sequence, in fact, reminded me of Porky Pig, which sparked me to create the Green Rabbit." We are left to wonder which character that even was. The Rockets Blast issue also appears to be the very first place to publish a parody comic of the film, which they called Star Woes. The cantina scene here amounts to 3 panels. Many parodies followed. Cracked magazine continued this trend next, in November of 1977, with issue 146. Crazy number 32's Star Warts appeared in December of 1977, and points for Bullwinkle. In January of 1978, Cracked number 148 gave buyers a Cantina Bar poster, if you completely ripped off the cover, that is. That same month, Mad finally got into the game with Star Roars in issue 196. Oscar the Grouch is a great touch. In December of 1978, they published The Force and I, the Mad Star Wars musical, in issue 203, with lyrics you can sing to the tune of By the Time I Get to Phoenix. Pause here if you want to sing, of course. January 1980 brings us back to Marvel, where Star Wars number 31 sees Luke back on Tatooine, and therefore, of course, is legally required to revisit the cantina, where he finds Han, again. This issue is also famous as the very last appearance of the Hutt with 1 T. A little-known yet legendary Star Wars comic was produced unofficially in Hungary in 1982 by Horvath Tibor and Attila Fazakis, whose names I am probably butchering. The black and white comic sold 300,000 copies and was later translated into English by a generous fan and put up for download. One interesting component of their cantina scene has been telling the bartender that he had to defend himself, saying, "What else could I do?" And there's a hand on the floor. The immediate years after Return of the Jedi were dark times for fans, but in 1987, a small comics company named Blackthorn published 3 issues of Star Wars comics, this time in 3D. Sadly, nobody cared, and it didn't help that 3D technology hadn't progressed beyond the 1950s red and blue glasses that cut the backs of your ears and gave you a headache. The first issue featured Luke and company returning to Tatooine in order to find somebody to look after his aunt and uncle's farm. which had been sitting there since the events of the first film. So where else to look but the Mos Eisley Cantina? It all goes downhill from there. This turkey was actually written by the great Len Wein, so go figure. You may recall, way back in Chapter 5, that we showed you a November 1977 Vogue magazine pictorial that oddly combined masks from Star Wars with models wearing fur coats, specifically for our purposes, one snaggletooth. As it turns out, Vogue shares some unused photos from the original shoot on their website. Now, why do you suppose this picture wasn't used? I mean, it's a perfectly good photo and, that gives me the creeps. In the fall of 1977, Lucasfilm allowed Star Wars characters and costumes to be available for use on television shows, and it was a cluster of these appearances in September of that year that actually resulted in a huge resurgence in ticket sales for the film, which was still in theaters. One of these early appearances was on the short-lived Richard Pryor Show, a program so controversial it only lasted 4 weeks on the air. At the very beginning of the first episode is a hilarious segment called Star Wars Bar, and it featured actual costumes and masks from the film, and an octopus monster, all supervised by Rick Baker. If you can imagine replacing customers of an actual inner-city bar with the aliens from the Mos Eisley Cantina, and replacing the bartender with Richard Pryor, then you are prepared for the 5-minute fever dream that is to follow. I only wish I could include it here in its entirety, but it is on YouTube on the official Pryor channel, and in excellent quality, so instead let's just pause here and give you time to go and watch it. You won't be disappointed. Okay, we're back. I told you that was amazing. Now let's walk through the highlights. The very first thing we even see is this Bith, wrapped in a bedsheet for some reason. Here, Labria and Erodian sit at a table and kiss passionately? What the? The wife of one Duros calls, and he insists he isn't there. The Wolfman and Yamnose call for a double, which is loudly slurped down. When the Wolfman picks a fight, the bartender calls Fuzz, the bouncer, played by Muftak in pants and suspenders. And how about Don Rickles dancing suggestively for Snaggletooth and being told to get a room? Are we really seeing this? Then the bartender asks a huge octopus monster, who is playing a game, I think, if Labria was the devil, and the octopus monster attacks him. It's Fuzz to the rescue, who drags the monster away. It's just another night in the Star Wars bar. I wonder what George thought of this. As it turns out, all vintage television appearances of the Cantina are completely bonkers, because in 1979, a public service announcement was actually made for the U.S. Department of Transportation using masks and costumes from the Cantina, only filmed in a big, dark room rather than actually building a set. Of course, 30 seconds doesn't allow much time to tell a story. There's a lot to see, and there are lots of quick cuts. This is another example I would love to incorporate here, but as there are many copies of this commercial on YouTube, one even remastered, let's just pause here again and allow you time to take it all in, because I imagine you will watch it more than once to make sure you weren't hallucinating. Starting now. And we're back. I told you. Let's look at some notable moments. One of the very first things we notice is that times are tough for the band, as they are now down to 3 members. There is a quick shot of the barroom with robed figures passing by. We can see both Duros, Muftak, and the Ket Malice alien from the Star Wars Holiday Special, as well as a humanoid bartender that looks like he may be wearing the facial appliance from the Kelbo alien from that show. Here is Ellis Hellrot wearing Bomb Vimden's vest, and Hammerhead with 2 blurry figures in the back. And here is Yamnose with him Dazon. Surely they've built a body for him by now, right? No. Apparently it's just a mask on a stick wrapped in a furry blanket with a dog collar tightened around it. Okay. Speaking of Bomb Vimden, he does a silly peekaboo thing here. Finally, our story begins. Muftak has really tied one on and is demanding more, becoming unruly. One of the Duros notices this. The raw emotion on his face is overwhelming. He puts his arm around his furry friend and helps him off screen. Behind everyone is the Ket Malice alien looking creepy. And then, the Millennium Falcon takes off? What the? Is this supposed to be them leaving? That's the best they could do. Now they're spaceship thieves. Then the moral of the story, made to look like the opening crawl. Note Black Falcon Limited, which was Lucas's short-lived merchandising company name at that time. Brought to you by the U.S. Department of Transportation and the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, because all this is going to make people not drink and drive. We have briefly mentioned the best-selling soundtrack album, which originally only included the first Cantina Band track. There are even some contemporary covers of the Cantina Band song that can be found, and here are 4 examples. Most other albums you find containing a cover of the track actually have a cover of this version by Miko. Miko, real name Domenico Minardo, saw Star Wars multiple times and convinced his record company to let him record a disco version of the soundtrack. This idea may sound silly today, but he actually knocked it out of the park, condensing the entire film into one side of an LP and telling the entire story of the movie in a fun 15 minutes. His Star Wars/Cantina Band 45 was a #1 hit single too, which is nothing to sneeze at. We have also already mentioned the great Story of Star Wars LP, whose description of the cantina matches the novel, but hearing Roscoe Lee Brown's narration is a treat. In 1981, Star Wars was brought to National Public Radio in a 13-episode drama that totaled 6 hours. The series was written by the late Brian Daley, whose job it was to flesh out the original details of the film, expanding sequences and devising new ones where needed. Even though the original cantina scene is less than 7 minutes in the movie, in the radio drama it's 14 minutes from Luke's entrance to Greedo's death. Upon entering the cantina, Luke describes it for the listeners in this way. "Will you look at this? I've never seen so many non-humans in one place. There's a Mirian hammerhead over there, and a Stofo lupinoid, couple of Tintin dwarfs. Boy, a lot of the humans don't look human." Additionally, Walrus Man and Dr. Evazan are identified here as Saw-Ki and Rufu, which in later years were explained away as aliases. In Chapter 7, we briefly covered the Kenner cassette for their movie viewer entitled Danger at the Cantina, which condenses the cantina scene into a short, silent loop that the user can crank as fast as they want, forwards or backwards. We also briefly mentioned the first home video release of the scene, Ken Films F64, their 8mm and Super 8 sequel to their smash hit 17-minute sampler of Star Wars scenes. Coming after the Cantina embargo we discussed in Chapter 7, the front of the box proudly proclaimed its inclusion of both the Death Star trench run and the cantina scene. But what we didn't do in that chapter was read you the description on the back of the box, which chooses Bom Vimden to represent the whole cantina, oddly. You have to hear this. One of the spectacular scenes in the film is set in the Cantina, a brawling spaceport bar in which director George Lucas assembles a menagerie of monsters and grotesques. Giant flies, cobras, sea creatures of every kind. What movie were they watching? I hope that you have enjoyed this documentary series, and most of all I hope that you can say that you learned a thing or two. I leave you with some words to live by, which apply to any entertainment franchise, any great art, and your own special memories as well. Vintage will never let you down. Nobody can ever take it away from you, and it will always be there for you. Don't ever let any person or company tell you that they've replaced it with their own inferior version, because they haven't. They've only made an inferior copy of a great thing. It's still there, just as it was. Those things are temporary, but vintage is forever. We've come to the end of the road, at least for completely adapting my book. And speaking of which, making this series has created the need for a new and 6th edition, so that will be the very next thing that happens. And if you have soldiered through all of the chapters in the playlist, then it's time for the reward that you were promised, your honorary degree in Cantinaology. Here is your very own certificate to fill out and print. You can frame and display it, impressing no one. Keep an eye out for more videos in the foreseeable future, but until then, thanks for watching, and bye for now.